The train was 40 minutes late, which gave Eleanor Whitmore too much time to think. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her worn leather traveling bag wedged between her feet, and she watched the snow come down outside the window in a way that wasn't beautiful anymore. It was just relentless. The kind of snow that didn't care what you had planned. The kind that buried things. She was 31 years old. She had a trunk in the luggage car that held everything she owned, which wasn't much. Some dresses, a few books, her mother's silver hairbrush with 2 of the bristles missing, a tin of lavender sachets she'd been given as a going-away gift by the women at the Millbrook Sewing Circle, most of whom had looked at her with a pity they didn't bother to disguise. She also carried, in the inside pocket of her coat, folded into thirds and soft at the creases from being read too many times, a letter. Well, a collection of letters, actually. 14 of them, spanning 8 months. The man who had written them was named Caleb Dawson. He was a widower with 5 children, working a cattle ranch outside a town called Harlow in the Montana Territory. He was, by the account of his own words, a man who had loved his wife deeply and missed her every day, who was not looking for someone to replace her but needed, and here was the word he'd used, which Eleanor had returned to again and again, needed a partner. Someone steady, someone who wouldn't flinch at the work. Eleanor Whitmore had spent a decade in Millbrook, Ohio, teaching the children of other people and keeping house for her ailing father and watching, year by year, as whatever future she had imagined for herself grew smaller and more distant, like a light going out. When her father died in the spring and the house was sold to cover his debts, she had found herself standing in a rented room with nothing ahead of her but more of the same, and she had answered an advertisement in a correspondence paper without letting herself think too hard about it. She had not expected the letters to be so good. Caleb Dawson wrote the way some men talked when they forgot to perform, plainly with a kind of rough sincerity that she had found more convincing than any poetry. He wrote about the cold, about the cattle, about a particular dog he'd had to put down in March, and how his youngest cried for 3 days. He wrote about what he needed in a practical sense: someone to help manage a household, someone to teach the children since the schoolhouse was 6 miles away. And he had not pretended that this was romantic exactly, but he had said, in the letter she'd read most often, "I think what I'm offering is a real life, if that's worth anything to you." She had decided it was. The train pulled into Harlow just past 9 o'clock in the evening, which was much too late, and Eleanor stepped onto the platform into a cold so immediate and sharp it took her breath like a hand at her throat. There was one gas lamp burning at the far end of the platform, and the snow was falling thick and sideways, and the station itself appeared to be closed. There was no one there to meet her. She stood with her trunk and her bag and waited for 15 minutes, watching the train disappear into the dark, and she thought, well, here it is. She didn't panic. Panic wasn't something she had the luxury of, and anyway, she'd learned years ago that it never helped. What she did was pick up her bag, drag her trunk under the narrow roof overhang, and stand there trying to think about what was reasonable. She had the address. Dawson Ranch, County Road 7, 4 miles north of the Harlow Depot. She had enough money left for perhaps 2 nights at a boarding house, if she could find one. She did not know this town. She did not know this territory. The wind was making a sound in the eaves of the station like something injured. Then she heard footsteps in the snow. Small ones, multiple. The crunch of boots moving faster than was sensible in this weather. And she turned, and there were children, 5 of them. Coming across the depot lot in a staggered line, the oldest in front and the youngest, impossibly small, a child barely more than a baby, being carried on the oldest one's back. They were bundled in coats that were too big and hats that didn't quite fit, and they were all, to a one, out of breath. Eleanor stared at them. The oldest one stopped a few feet away and said, gasping, "You're Eleanor Whitmore." She wasn't a question. She was a statement. Eleanor looked at the girl. She was perhaps 13, tall for her age, with dark circles under her eyes that had no business being on a child's face, and said carefully, "I am." "I'm Nora," the girl said. "Nora Dawson. This is Henry." She tilted her head toward a boy of about 11, solidly built, watchful. Clara and George. 2 more, Clara perhaps 8, George a year or 2 younger, both of them regarding Eleanor with expressions she couldn't quite read. "And the one on my back is May. She's 4. "Hello," Eleanor said, because she didn't know what else to say. May, from her position on Nora's back, looked at Eleanor with enormous dark eyes and said nothing at all. "Our horse threw a shoe 2 miles back," Nora said. "We left him at the miller's. We ran the rest of the way." She paused. "We didn't want you to think nobody was coming." Eleanor looked at these 5 children standing in the blowing snow, the oldest one carrying the youngest, all of them breathing hard. And something moved in her chest that she didn't have a name for yet. "Your father," she said, "is he—" The change that came over Nora's face was small and fast and devastating. It was the look of someone bracing for something they'd been carrying too long. "Our father doesn't know you're here," Nora said. Eleanor went very still. "He doesn't know I wrote you either," Nora continued, and her voice was perfectly even, which was somehow worse than if it had wavered. "The letters, all 14 of them, I wrote every one. The wind came through and lifted the snow in a spiral off the platform roof, and somewhere down the street a door banged against its frame, and Eleanor Whitmore stood in the dark with her trunk and her bag and her 14 letters, and the understanding settling through her like cold water finding every crack. "You," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "You wrote to me, as your father." "Yes, ma'am." "All of them." "Yes." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How old are you?" 13. "You write like an adult." Something flickered in the girl's expression. Not pride, exactly, but something close to it, complicated by guilt. "I read a lot," she said. Eleanor looked at the 5 of them. Henry, who hadn't moved, was watching her with the careful attention of someone waiting to see which way something would fall. Clara had taken George's hand. May had pressed her face into Nora's shoulder. "Does your father know you're here right now?" "No," Nora said. "He thinks we're in bed." "And what does he—" Eleanor stopped. She was assembling the picture, and she didn't entirely like what it looked like. "What does your father know about any of this?" "Nothing," Nora said. "He doesn't know I answered the advertisement. He doesn't know I wrote the letters. He doesn't know you're here." She paused. "He wouldn't have approved." "No," Eleanor said slowly. "I wouldn't imagine he would." A long silence. The snow kept coming. "Miss Whitmore," Nora said, and now there was something in her voice that was not carefully constructed. That was just a 13-year-old girl who was exhausted and scared and had apparently been running a household on nerve alone. "I know what I did was wrong. I know it, but I didn't know what else to do. My father, he doesn't get out of bed some days. He doesn't talk. He hasn't talked, really, since our mother died. And that was 2 years ago. And I've been—" She stopped, started again. "I've been doing the best I can, but I'm 13, and May has nightmares. And George got sick in October, and I didn't know what to do for him, and I just—" She stopped again. She had run out of the careful composure she'd been holding together, and for a moment she was just a child, which is what she was. Clara started crying quietly, without making much noise. "We need somebody," Henry said. It was the first time he'd spoken. His voice was lower than Eleanor expected, rough at the edges. "We need a grown-up, a real one. Nora tries, but she shouldn't have to." May lifted her face from Nora's shoulder and looked at Eleanor. "Please," May said. One word, very small. Eleanor Whitmore stood there for what felt like a long time. She thought about the money she'd spent on the train ticket, which she could not get back. She thought about the letter she'd written to a man who had never written back, who had in fact never written to her at all. She thought about the room she'd given up in Millbrook, and the women at the sewing circle, and the look on their faces when she'd said she was going west to be married. She thought about these children in the snow. She picked up her bag. "Someone is going to need to help me with this trunk," she said. The house was 4 miles out, and they made it in an hour and a half because Henry insisted on pulling the trunk himself and wouldn't accept help, which meant they went slowly. Eleanor carried May on her back for the last 2 miles. The child weighed almost nothing, which troubled her more than it should have, and she fell asleep somewhere around the 2nd mile with her cheek against Eleanor's shoulder. She was too light. That was the thing. A 4-year-old should have more weight to her. Nora walked beside Eleanor and didn't say much. Neither did Eleanor. There was a particular kind of exhaustion between them that had nothing to do with the walk and everything to do with what had just happened at the depot. and Eleanor thought that whatever came next, it needed to come after she'd seen the whole of the situation with her own eyes. The ranch appeared out of the dark gradually, the way things did in snowstorms. First the fence line, then the shape of a barn, then the main house, which was large and square and dark except for a single light burning in what appeared to be a downstairs window. "He's awake," Nora said, and her voice was flat. "Is that unusual?" "He doesn't sleep much." They came through the gate and across the yard, and Eleanor noticed, even in the dark and snow, that the fence needed mending in two places, that one of the barn doors was hanging slightly off its hinge, that the woodpile beside the house was lower than it should be for winter. None of these things were disasters. All of them were the kind of things that accumulated when there wasn't enough time or attention, or she suspected will. Nora stopped at the front door and turned to look at Eleanor. "I should warn you," she said. "I imagine you should," Eleanor agreed. "He's not—" Nora paused, seeming to search for the word. "He's not cruel. He's not a cruel man. He just isn't present. Not really. He goes through the days, but he's not in them." "Grief does that," Eleanor said. Something in Nora's face shifted. "Does it stop?" Eleanor thought about her mother dying when she was 11, about her father after, spending 3 years sleeping in his chair by the window, about how slowly that had changed and how it had never entirely gone back to what it was before. "It changes," she said. "That's what I can honestly tell you." Nora nodded once, as though this was enough, and opened the door. The inside of the house was warm, at least that, and cleaner than Eleanor had expected, given the circumstances. Nora had clearly been working hard at it. The kitchen was orderly, if sparse. There was a fire going in the main room. There was evidence everywhere of children living in a house without quite enough supervision. A boot in the wrong place, a cup left on the windowsill, a child's drawing tacked to the wall with a single pin, curling at the corners. The man sitting at the kitchen table didn't look up when they came in. He was tall. She could see that even seated. Dark-haired, with several days of beard, dressed in work clothes that looked like he'd slept in them. He had a cup of something in front of him and his hands around it, but he wasn't drinking. He was just sitting there, staring at the surface of the table, and for a moment Eleanor had the unsettling impression that this was what he did most of the time. Then he looked up, and his eyes went from Nora to Eleanor, and something happened in his face that she couldn't quite read. Surprise, certainly, and confusion, and something else. A kind of alarm, like a man who has been caught doing something he shouldn't. "Nora," he said. His voice was low and a little rough, the voice of someone who didn't use it much. "Who is this?" It wasn't a question either. It was the particular tone of a man who suspected the answer was going to be a problem. Nora had squared her shoulders in the door. Eleanor noticed this, the squaring of the shoulders, the small, unconscious preparation. The girl did it automatically, which meant she'd had occasion to do it before. "This is Eleanor Whitmore," Nora said. "She's come from Ohio. I wrote to her, Papa. I wrote to her, and she answered, and I've been writing back, and she's here." The silence that followed had a particular quality to it. Eleanor had the thought that you could measure certain kinds of anger not by how loud they were, but by how quiet the room got when they arrived. Caleb Dawson looked at his daughter for a very long moment. Then he looked at Eleanor. His eyes were dark, nearly black in the lamplight, and they were not empty, which was what she'd half expected. They were, if anything, too full of something that had been sitting in there without outlet for so long that it had changed into something else, harder and more complicated than sorrow. "You wrote to her as me," he said to Nora. "Yes." "You signed my name." "Yes." "For how long?" "8 months." Another silence. "Leave the room," Caleb said. "Papa." "Nora." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Take your brothers and sisters and go upstairs." Eleanor felt May, who was still half asleep against her shoulder, shift and make a small unhappy sound. She transferred the child carefully to Nora, and Nora took her without a word. Henry came to stand beside his sister, and Clara took George's hand, and the four of them filed toward the stairs in a way that suggested this was not the first time they had been asked to leave a room. Nora paused at the bottom of the stairs and looked back at Eleanor. Her expression said something complicated, something between "I'm sorry" and "thank you," and please don't leave. And then she went upstairs and Eleanor was alone with Caleb Dawson. He stood up from the table. He was taller than she'd thought. Quite tall, with the particular kind of build that came from years of physical labor, broad through the shoulders, and he moved like a man who was tired in his bones, not just his body. He went to the stove and stood there with his back to her for a moment, and when he turned around, his arms were crossed, and his expression was the careful blankness of a man trying very hard to keep something controlled. "I apologize," he said, "for whatever my daughter told you. Whatever she said, I wrote. I didn't write it." "I know that now," Eleanor said. "She had no right." "No," Eleanor agreed. "She didn't." He looked at her. She got the sense this was not the response he'd expected. "I'm not here to argue with you about what your daughter did," Eleanor said, because she had made a decision somewhere between the train platform and this kitchen about how she was going to handle this, and that decision was to be as direct as possible. She was tired, her feet were wet, and she was not going to pretend to delicacy she didn't feel. "I'm here because I came a very long way on the basis of letters that turned out not to be what they appeared to be. And now I'm here, and it's 10 o'clock at night, and I'm going to need somewhere to sleep before I can think about what to do next." Caleb stared at her. "That's it," she said. That's my position right now. You want to stay the night? I'd like to not stand in the snow while I figure out my situation. Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There's a room, off the kitchen. It was for a hired hand. We had one for a while. It's small. Small is fine." He looked at her again, and she had the impression he was trying to figure out what to do with her, which was fair because she was trying to figure out what to do with herself. "I'll get the lamp," he said. "What?" The room was small and cold and smelled like cedar and dust, and it held a narrow iron bed and a chest of drawers and a hook on the back of the door. Eleanor stood in it with her bag on the floor and the lamp Caleb had given her, and she listened to his footsteps cross the kitchen and heard the table chair scrape and then quiet. She sat on the edge of the bed. She unfolded the letters, all 14 of them, and laid them out on the mattress beside her. She read them not as she had read them before, looking for the man who'd written them, but looking now for the child who had. And it was there, once she knew to look for it, the particular precocity of a very smart 13-year-old, the places where the language went slightly too formal, slightly too considered, the way the letters knew how to describe practical things with real accuracy, the ranch, the cattle, the children, but turned careful and almost studied when they described feeling. "I think what I'm offering is a real life, if that's worth anything to you." Nora had written that. Nora, who was 13 and had been holding a household together for 2 years, and who had, apparently, decided that the thing her family needed was a woman who would answer an advertisement in a correspondence paper. Eleanor folded the letters back up and put them in her bag. She was angry. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself. She had spent 8 months writing letters to a man who didn't exist, had arranged her entire future around a correspondence that turned out to be a lie, and she was sitting in a cold room in Montana at 10 o'clock at night with no plan and very little money and nowhere else to go. She was angry, but she had also carried Mae Dawson on her back for 2 miles in the snow, and she had felt the lightness of that child, the insufficient weight of her, and she had seen the look on Nora's face at the bottom of the stairs. She blew out the lamp and lay down in her coat and stared at the ceiling. "Please," Mae had said. One word, 4 years old, in the dark on a train platform. Eleanor closed her eyes. In the morning, she woke to the sound of someone moving in the kitchen, and for a moment, half a moment, the loose space before full consciousness, she didn't know where she was. Then she did, and she lay there for a few seconds with that knowledge sitting on her chest. She got up. She washed her face with water from the pitcher that had been left, at some point, on the dresser. Cold water, nearly ice. And she looked at herself in the small square mirror on the wall. She looked tired. She looked like a woman who had spent the night on a narrow mattress in a strange room after a day of hard travel, which was what she was. She straightened her clothes, put her hair up, and opened the door to the kitchen. Nora was there, moving between the stove and the table with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had been doing this for a long time. She had a pot of something going, oatmeal, Eleanor thought, from the smell, and she was cutting bread at the counter, and she didn't look up when Eleanor came in, but her shoulders went up slightly, the way shoulders did when a person was bracing for something. "Good morning," Eleanor said. "Good morning," Nora said, still not looking up. Eleanor went to the stove and stood beside it for the warmth, and looked around the kitchen in the daylight. It was better in daylight, and also worse. Better because she could see the care that had been taken. The swept floor, the organized shelves, the kindling stacked neatly beside the stove. Worse because she could also see what was lacking. The depleted larder, the curtain on the far window that had come down from one side and not been rehung, the absence of anything that suggested a child's presence in this kitchen was welcome rather than necessary. "Where is your father?" Eleanor asked. "Barn," Nora said. "He's always in the barn in the mornings." "And the children?" "Henry feeds the chickens first thing. Clara and George are still sleeping. May—" Nora glanced toward the small room off the main hall. "May doesn't sleep well. She was up in the night. She's sleeping now." Eleanor nodded slowly. She said, "I need to talk to you about what I'm going to do." Nora went still, though her hands kept moving on the bread. "All right." "I should leave," Eleanor said. "That's what I should do. I should go back to Harlow today and book a ticket and figure out what's next." Nora's hand stopped. "I said that's what I should do," Eleanor said. "I didn't say it's what I'm going to do." Nora turned to look at her for the first time. Her expression was very careful. "Your father has to know that what you did was wrong," Eleanor said. "I'm not going to pretend to him that it wasn't. I'm not going to manufacture some story about how this happened. He's going to have to deal with this, and with me, with the truth of it." She paused. "But I'm not going to leave you this morning. I don't have it in me to walk away this morning." Nora stared at her. "That is not a promise," Eleanor said. "I want to be honest with you about that. I don't know what your father is going to say, or what we're going to work out between us, or whether any of this makes any sense at all, but I'm not leaving this morning." Nora looked at her for a long moment. She was 13, and she was trying very hard not to cry, and she was not entirely succeeding. "Okay," she said. Her voice was small. "Okay," Eleanor said. "Now, what do you need done?" Caleb Dawson came in from the barn at 7:30, stamping snow from his boots in the doorway, and he stopped when he saw Eleanor at the kitchen table with a pile of mending in her hands. He looked at her. He looked at Nora, who was serving oatmeal into bowls at the stove. He looked at May, who had woken up in the last half hour and was now sitting on the kitchen bench regarding Eleanor with the focused attention of a small animal that hasn't decided yet whether something is safe. "Good morning," Eleanor said, without looking up from the mending. There was a long pause. "Morning," Caleb said. He took off his coat. He hung it on the hook by the door. He sat down at the table and accepted the bowl Nora put in front of him, and he didn't say anything else, and Eleanor didn't say anything else either. The children came in gradually. Henry, still cold from outside, Clara pulling George by the hand. And they sat down and ate. And for a while the only sounds were the sounds of spoons and the fire and the wind outside. And Eleanor kept on with the mending, which was a shirt of Henry's with a split seam. After a while, May got down from the bench and came around the table and stood next to Eleanor and watched her work. "What's that?" May asked. "A stitch," Eleanor said. "I'm closing a hole." May leaned closer, her little hands on the edge of the table. "How come it went in and came out?" "That's how you make it hold," Eleanor said. "You have to go through and come back, otherwise it falls apart." May considered this with enormous seriousness. Then she climbed, uninvited, onto the bench beside Eleanor and leaned against her arm to watch. Eleanor didn't say anything about this. She kept sewing. Across the table, Caleb Dawson was looking at his youngest daughter leaning against a stranger's arm in his kitchen, and something crossed his face that he didn't seem to know what to do with. He pushed back from the table and went outside. They didn't talk until evening. Eleanor spent the day in the house because there was no shortage of things to be done there. The curtain rehanging alone took an hour because the bracket had pulled out of the wall and needed to be reset, and she had to find the tools for it, which meant going through a drawer in the kitchen that apparently housed everything that had no other home, sorted by no discernible principle. She relined the larder shelves, which had gotten damp. She helped Clara with sums at the kitchen table while May played on the floor with a wooden horse missing one leg. She listened to George tell her, in patient and considerable detail, about a fox he'd seen at the edge of the property in November, which he believed was living in a hole beneath the old oak by the creek. "Have you seen it since?" she asked. "3 times, George said. But I haven't told Henry because Henry thinks we should trap it." "And you don't want to trap it." "I want to watch it," George said, with the certainty of someone who has thought this through. "You can't watch something once it's in a trap." "No," Eleanor agreed. "You can't." Henry came in mid-afternoon with a bucket of milk and set it on the counter and looked at Eleanor with that watchful, measuring expression he'd had since the depot. "You're still here," he said. "I am," she said. He considered this. "Are you staying?" "I don't know yet," she said, because honesty was the thing she had decided on, and she was going to maintain it even when it was uncomfortable. "That depends on some things." "On our father," Henry said. "Partly," she said. "Partly on me." Henry was quiet for a moment. He said, "He's not always like this." "Like what?" Henry made a gesture she couldn't quite interpret, something between absent and shut. "Like this. Before Mama died, he used to laugh a lot. He used to bring us into the barn when calves were born, let us name them. He used to—" He stopped. "He hasn't been like that in a while." "I know," Eleanor said. "Your sister told me." "Nora keeps everything going," Henry said, and there was something in his voice that was love and resentment and worry all at once, the particular cocktail of a child who has watched his sibling carry too much. "She shouldn't have to do it all." "No," Eleanor said, "she shouldn't." Henry looked at her. "She said she wrote to you, pretended to be him." "She did. Are you angry?" "Yes," Eleanor said. Henry absorbed this. "But you're still here." "I'm still here," she said. Caleb found her after supper when the children had been sent up and the kitchen was quiet. She was heating water for washing, and she heard him come in from outside and stop, and she didn't turn around. He stood in the doorway for long enough that she thought maybe he was going to leave again. Then he came and sat down at the table and put his hands flat on the wood, and she took the kettle off the stove and set it on the stand and turned to look at him. "I'm not going to apologize to you for what Nora did," he said. Eleanor sat down across from him. "I didn't ask you to." "It was wrong. I know it was wrong. She knows it. But I can't—" He stopped, started over. "I can't be responsible for what she did." "No," Eleanor agreed. "You can't." He looked at her. "Then what do you want from me?" It was a direct question, and she appreciated that, even if the directness had a defensive edge to it. She folded her hands on the table and thought about what to say. "I want to understand what's happening in this house," she said finally. "I want to know if there's something here that makes sense for me to stay for, or whether I should go back to Harlow and make some other plan. And I want to have that conversation honestly, without either of us pretending the situation is something it isn't." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you know about the situation? I know you lost your wife 2 years ago. I know you've been struggling since. I know your oldest daughter has been running this household on her own, and she's 13 years old, and she's exhausted. I know your youngest child is too thin and has nightmares." She paused. "I know you're a man who's still in his grief and hasn't found a way out of it yet, and I know that whatever Nora hoped to fix by writing to me, she wasn't wrong that something needed fixing." Something moved across Caleb Dawson's face. It was brief, and it was complicated, and she thought, underneath all the hard-edged composure, there was something in him that was a long way from okay. "I didn't ask her to write to you," he said. His voice was careful. "I know. I didn't ask for any of this." "I know that too," Eleanor said, "but here we both are." He looked at his hands on the table. After a moment he said, "I can't offer you what the letters said. I don't know what was in them, what she—" He stopped again. "Whatever she promised you. I'm not in a position to make those promises." "She promised me work and a household to manage and children who needed teaching," Eleanor said. "She promised me a real life. Those things seem to be accurate." He lifted his eyes to hers. "I'm not asking you for anything else," she said. "Not right now. Right now I'm asking if you need help and whether you'd accept it from me." The silence in the kitchen was very long. The fire settled. Outside, the wind made its sound in the eaves. "I don't know what I need," Caleb said finally, and it came out rougher than she thought he meant it to. rougher and more honest, the words of a man who had not said a true thing in a very long time. "I don't know. He stopped. "I've been going through the days. That's all I've been doing." "I know," Eleanor said quietly. "The children—" He looked at his hands again. "I know they need more than I've been giving them. I know that. He seemed to run out of words. Or maybe he had them and didn't know how to release them. "You don't have to explain it," Eleanor said. He looked at her, and something in that look was raw in a way she thought embarrassed him. "Stay through Christmas," he said. His voice was flat, as though he'd pressed the feeling out of it on purpose. "Through Christmas. After that, we'll figure out what makes sense." It was not a romantic offer. It was not really even a warm one. It was a man at the end of his rope throwing a knot and saying, "Hold here." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "All right." He nodded once, got up from the table, put his coat on and went back to the barn, which was apparently what he did with himself when things got to be too much. And Eleanor sat alone in the kitchen with the fire and the kettle and the quiet that was left when he was gone. She thought about Ohio. She thought about the rented room. She thought about May's weight on her back in the snow, and Nora's squared shoulders, and Henry's careful watching, and Clara crying quietly in the dark. She thought about going through the days. She got up and began to wash the supper dishes, because they needed to be done. And she was here. And that was enough for now. Outside, the snow kept falling. The ranch sat in the dark, cold and imperfect, and very much in need of someone who wouldn't flinch. Eleanor Whitmore washed the dishes and did not flinch. She had not planned to stay past the first morning. That was the honest truth of it, the thing Eleanor turned over in the quieter moments of those first days, that she had told Nora she wasn't leaving that morning, which was a very different thing from saying she was staying, and she had meant the distinction when she made it. She had kept it vague on purpose, the way you kept a door from fully closing when you weren't sure yet what was on the other side. But the first morning became the second, and the second became a week. And somewhere in that week, Eleanor Whitmore stopped doing the mental arithmetic of train tickets and departure times and started just doing what was in front of her, which was considerable. The house needed work. Not the kind of work that came from neglect exactly. Nora had held things together with a stubbornness that was, frankly, impressive, but the kind that came from one person stretched across too many tasks for too long. Things had been maintained but not repaired, fed but not nourished, kept going but not tended. The larder was the first real problem. Eleanor went through it on that second day with the systematic attention of someone who had managed a household on limited means before, and what she found was enough to sustain a family on the surface and not much more. Dried beans, salt pork, less of it than there should have been, cornmeal, flour, a jar of preserves that was down to its last inch, a half-empty crock of lard, some root vegetables starting to go soft in the corner. "When did you last have meat?" she asked Nora, who was standing behind her in the larder doorway. Nora thought about it. "Henry shot a rabbit last week." "Before that?" A pause. "November, I think. Papa butchered one of the older hens." Eleanor looked at the shelf and did not let her expression say anything she didn't want it to say. She asked, "What's in the smokehouse?" "Not much," Nora said. "Papa was going to smoke the fall beef, but he didn't get to it in time. Some of it went." Eleanor closed the larder door. "All right," she said. "Here's what we're going to do." What they did was this. Eleanor took stock of what they had and made a list, which she gave to Caleb that evening with the directness that seemed to be the only register he responded to. She told him what they needed from town, what could wait, and what couldn't. She told him the preserves wouldn't last past the end of December and the flour was closer to empty than it looked. She told him the children needed more protein than they were getting, which was maybe not the thing you said to a grieving man, but it was the true thing, and she said it. He took the list without looking at her. He went to town the next morning and came back with the wagon loaded, and he put the things on the kitchen table without comment, and that was the end of that particular conversation. But also, she thought, the beginning of something she didn't have a name for yet. He listened. That was the thing. He didn't talk, and he didn't make it easy, but he listened. Christmas was 3 weeks away when Eleanor arrived, which meant Nora had been quietly panicking about it for longer than that, in the way that a child who has taken on adult responsibilities panics about things. silently, alone, in the middle of the night. Eleanor figured this out on the fourth day, when she found Nora at the kitchen table very late, after everyone else was in bed, with a stub of pencil and a piece of paper and a look on her face that was pure unadorned stress. Eleanor sat down across from her. "What are you working on?" she asked, even though she could see it was a list of some kind. "Christmas," Nora said. She didn't try to hide it. "Last year I tried to do something, made a pie, put some pine boughs over the mantel." She looked at the paper. May cried the whole day. She was too little to understand, but she knew something was wrong. George didn't eat. Henry just stopped. Henry went out to the barn in the morning and didn't come back until dark. "And your father?" Nora was quiet for a moment. "He didn't come downstairs." Eleanor looked at the list. It said, at the top, in careful handwriting, "Things to do for Christmas." Below that there were 3 items, and then a long blank space, as though she had run out of ideas or nerve. "What do you want this Christmas to look like?" Eleanor asked. Nora looked up. The question seemed to catch her off guard, as though she hadn't been thinking about what she wanted, only about what she could manage. "I want it to feel like something real," Nora said finally. Not trying and failing, not everyone pretending. "I want May to have a good Christmas. She doesn't really remember Mama anymore. She was only 2 when she died. She doesn't know what Christmas is supposed to feel like." Her voice stayed even, but her hands were flat on the table, pressed down, which Eleanor was starting to recognize as Nora's version of holding herself together. "I just want her to know what it's supposed to feel like." Eleanor looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "We have 3 weeks." "I know." "That's enough time," Eleanor said. "If we're organized." Nora stared at her. "You're going to help." "I'm here, aren't I?" Eleanor said, which was a different answer than yes, but which contained it. The thing about children is that they adapt. Eleanor had learned this years ago, teaching in Millbrook, that children who had been through hard things developed a kind of bruised flexibility, a capacity to absorb the new alongside the old, to hold both without being destroyed by the contradiction. It didn't mean the hard things didn't matter. It just meant that children were, in some ways, tougher than adults gave them credit for. The Dawson children were adapting to her. May was the first, because she was 4 and 4-year-olds operate largely on instinct. She had decided, somewhere in that first night, that Eleanor was safe, and she moved through the subsequent days with the unself-conscious confidence of a child who has made up her mind. She followed Eleanor through the house. She sat beside her at the table. She asked a continuous, unhurried stream of questions about whatever Eleanor was doing. Why do you fold it that way? Why does bread need to rise? Why do you have to stir it? And she accepted the answers with the solemn attention of someone filing them away for future use. George was next, by way of the fox. He came to Eleanor 2 days in with an update. He had seen it again, this time at the edge of the wood, and he thought it might be a female because of the way she moved, quick and low. And did Eleanor know anything about foxes? Eleanor did not know a great deal, but she knew how to ask good questions. And George turned out to be a child who bloomed when someone took him seriously, who had observations stacked up inside him waiting for someone to be interested. By the end of the week, he was showing her his notebook, a battered thing he'd been keeping since summer, filled with drawings and notes about the animals on and around the property, and explaining, with a seriousness that was entirely genuine, his theory about where the fox's den was. Clara came to her sideways. She was a quieter child than the others, careful and watchful, the one who cried without making noise. And she had been burned, Eleanor thought, by loving things that went away. She didn't offer trust easily. But one afternoon, Eleanor found her struggling with the heel of a stocking she was knitting. She was teaching herself from a book, which told you something about this family's capacity for self-directed effort. And Eleanor sat down and showed her how to turn the heel properly, and Clara focused on her hands with absolute attention and didn't say much, but the next day she came and sat beside Eleanor while Eleanor was reading and didn't ask for anything, just sat. And Eleanor understood that this was Clara's version of letting someone in. Henry was the hardest. He was 11 and he was male, and he had, Eleanor suspected, made some private decision after his mother died to be the second adult in the house, to hold himself together not because it was easy, but because he felt someone had to. He was helpful in the way that a person is helpful when they're watching to see if they can trust you enough to stop being useful and just be a child for a while. He did chores without being asked. He fixed things he wasn't big enough to fix easily, and sometimes fixed them wrong, but would not ask for help. He looked at Eleanor with that measuring watchfulness and waited. The thaw with Henry came on the 6th day, and it came from an unexpected direction. Eleanor was in the barn because one of the young heifers had been off her feed, and she'd wanted to look at her, and she found Henry already there, crouched beside the animal's head, talking to her in a low voice. He didn't hear Eleanor come in, and she stopped in the doorway and didn't announce herself, just watched. He was telling the heifer, in a quiet and completely earnest tone, about something that had happened at the creek that morning, a detail about the ice and how thick it was. And there was something in it, the unself-consciousness of a boy talking to an animal, because he had something to say and no one to say it to. That made Eleanor's chest ache. She went back outside. When Henry came into the kitchen 20 minutes later, she looked up from what she was doing and said, "How is she?" He stopped. "She's eating a little now. I warmed the water." "Good thinking," Eleanor said. "Warm water can help." He didn't say anything else, but he came and sat at the table for a while, and he didn't leave as quickly as usual, and that was enough. Nora was a different matter, and a harder one to read. There was gratitude in her. Eleanor could see it, the way she watched Eleanor work, the way she had, in those first few days, the expression of someone who had been holding everything up alone and has finally, tentatively, shifted some of the weight. But there was also something else, something guilty and watchful and uncertain, as though Nora was always half expecting Eleanor to leave and was bracing for it rather than letting herself believe she would stay. Eleanor understood this. The girl had done the impossible thing of bringing Eleanor here and now lived with the knowledge that it was built on a lie, that the whole fragile structure of it could come apart at any moment, and that it would be her fault if it did. On the 8th day, Eleanor found Nora crying in the pantry. Not dramatically. She was sitting on the floor between the shelves with her knees pulled up and her head down, and she wasn't making much noise, and when Eleanor opened the door, she looked up with an expression that was more resignation than embarrassment, as though she'd known she'd be found eventually. Eleanor sat down on the floor across from her. It was a tight fit. The pantry was small, but she sat. "What is it?" Eleanor asked. Nora shook her head. "You don't have to tell me," Eleanor said. "But I'm going to sit here either way, so—" A long pause. Then Nora said, "I keep thinking you're going to leave." "I might," Eleanor said, because she had committed to honesty and she meant it. "I don't know yet what I'm going to do, but I'm not leaving today." "That's what you said before." "It's still true." "What if my father—" Nora stopped. "What if he tells you to go?" Eleanor thought about Caleb Dawson sitting at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the wood, his voice gone rough with the weight of things he couldn't say. "We'll deal with that if it comes," she said. "He doesn't talk to you." "He doesn't talk to anyone." "He used to," Nora said, and this came out with a rawness she hadn't intended, the kind that slips past the guard. "He used to be different. I know he can be. I remember what he was like, and sometimes I look at him now and I can't—" She stopped. "I can't find it. I can't find the person he used to be in there." Eleanor looked at her. "He's in there," she said. "Grief buries people. It doesn't always take them." Nora looked at the floor. "What if it does?" "Then you deal with that," Eleanor said. "But you don't deal with it at 13 by yourself. That much I can tell you." They sat in the pantry for a while longer, on the floor between the shelves, and it was not comfortable and it was not pretty, but it was the most honest thing Eleanor had done in some time, and she thought Nora felt that too. The preparations for Christmas started in earnest in the 2nd week. Eleanor made a proper list, materials needed, task divided, a rough sequence for what needed to happen when, and she went through it with Nora at the kitchen table the way she used to plan lessons back in Millbrook, which was methodically but not rigidly, with room for the unexpected. They needed a tree, which Henry and George agreed to retrieve from the wood with an enthusiasm that was the most purely childlike thing Eleanor had seen either of them produce. They needed to make gifts, because there was no money for buying them, which Eleanor turned into a project of a different kind. She helped Clara knit George a scarf with the remainder of last winter's yarn, helped George make a wooden puzzle for May using pieces of a broken crate from the barn, helped May decorate a small box for Nora with bits of ribbon, and pressed flowers from the dried arrangement on the mantel, though May's contribution to this project was largely supervision and strong opinions. For Henry, Eleanor found a worn almanac in the bottom of the bookcase and spent an evening carefully copying out the sections on animal husbandry and weather prediction into a clean notebook she'd made from folded paper sewn at the spine. It wasn't much, but she'd watched him in the barn, had seen what he cared about, and she thought he would use it. These small projects changed the atmosphere of the house in a way that was difficult to quantify but impossible to miss. There was something happening in those evenings when Eleanor and the children sat around the kitchen table working on things together. Something that was, underneath all the industry of it, just company. Just the sound of people in the same room making something, talking about small things, occasionally arguing about whether May's ribbon bow was straight. It wasn't, but May was committed to it. Laughter started coming back. Not big laughter. Nothing theatrical. Small things. George saying something completely unexpected about the fox that made Henry snort. Clara, who was not given to humor, producing a deadpan observation about the heifer's facial expression that sent May into helpless giggles. Eleanor telling a story about a student in Millbrook who had once, with great confidence, spelled his own name wrong on 3 consecutive examinations, and the children wanting to hear it again. Caleb was not part of these evenings. He sat at the far end of the table or in the main room, within earshot, but outside the circle of it, and Eleanor did not push. She said goodnight to him when she passed. She left food where he could find it. She told him, matter-of-factly, what the children had done each day, the way you gave a report, without asking anything in return. But she was watching, without appearing to watch, and she saw things. She saw him, one evening, pause in the doorway to the kitchen when he heard May laughing. Pause there for several seconds, with an expression on his face that was complicated and held too many things at once, and then move on without coming in. She saw him, coming back from the barn one morning, stop at the window and look through it at Eleanor helping George with the fox notebook, both of them bent over it at the table. She saw him pick up May's wooden horse from the floor where it had fallen, the one with the missing leg, and turn it in his hands for a moment before setting it on the windowsill where it could be found. He was there. He was paying attention. He had just lost the way in. 12 days before Christmas, Eleanor made gingerbread. It was not a calculated decision. She found molasses in the back of the larder that she'd missed on first pass, and she had the spices, and she made it because it was the thing that made sense to make. The smell filled the kitchen and worked its way through the house the way smells do in winter when the windows are closed, completely, inescapably, like a memory made physical. May appeared at the kitchen door 3 minutes in, still in her nightdress, having apparently gotten out of bed with the determination of a child following her nose. "What is that?" May demanded. "Gingerbread," Eleanor said. May's eyes went wide. "Like in the book?" "What book?" "Nora reads us a book. There's a man made of gingerbread. He runs away." "This gingerbread is not going to run away," Eleanor said. "It's going to stay in the pan and then get eaten." May came fully into the kitchen and climbed onto the bench to watch, which was her standard position for observing Eleanor at work, and she watched with the absorbed attention she brought to everything until the pan went into the oven, and then she sat there keeping watch over the oven as though she could encourage it by proximity. Nora came next, and then Clara, and then George, and they all ended up in the kitchen in various states of morning disarray, and there was a certain chaotic warmth to it that Eleanor noticed without commenting on, because pointing at warmth sometimes made it go away. Henry came in last and stood in the doorway eating a biscuit from the previous day and pretending he wasn't as interested as he was. "Is that gingerbread?" he said, in the tone of someone confirming a suspicious development. "Yes," Eleanor said. He came and sat down. The gingerbread came out of the oven brown and imperfect. One corner rose more than the other, and she cut around it. And they ate it at the kitchen table, all 5 children, still warm, and the sound in the kitchen was the sound of children actually eating something and talking about it, and it had a particular texture to it, a particular aliveness, that had been absent from this house for a long time. Caleb came in from outside just as they were finishing. He stood in the doorway and looked at the table, at his children's faces, at the crumbs, at the particular glow that settles on people who have just eaten something good in warm company. and something happened in his expression that Eleanor couldn't quite name. "There's some left," she said, without making it a big thing. He looked at the pan on the counter. He came in, slowly, and cut himself a piece, and he ate it standing at the counter with his back half turned, and nobody made a thing of it, and when he was done, he set his plate in the wash basin and went back to the barn. But he'd come in. That was new. 2 weeks in, Eleanor and Nora carried a crate of decorations down from the storage room above the stairs. It was mostly Nora who knew what was up there. The garlands of dried berries that she and her mother had made together, the wooden ornaments carved over years, a string of bells on a red ribbon. Some of it had been packed carelessly, which was the packing of someone who had put it away in grief and hadn't wanted to look at it. Some of the dried berries had crumbled. One of the ornaments had a crack down its center. Nora sat on the floor of the upstairs hall with the broken ornament in her hands and looked at it. "It was Mama's," she said. "She made it the first year they were married." Eleanor sat down beside her. She looked at the ornament. It was a small carved dove, split now down the breast. "Can it be fixed?" Nora asked. Eleanor looked at it carefully. "Maybe," she said. "With the right glue, and if you're careful, it won't be invisible, the repair. You'll see where it broke." Nora turned it in her hands. "That's all right," she said quietly. "Things can still work after they've broken. They're just different than they were." Eleanor looked at her. 13 years old, sitting on the floor of a drafty hall in Montana, holding a broken ornament and finding the metaphor in it herself without any help. The particular loneliness of a very perceptive child. "Yes," Eleanor said. "That's right." They brought the decorations down and the children spent an afternoon arranging things on the mantel and hanging the bells on the door and putting the garland along the windowsill. And there was bickering. George and May had opposing views about where the bells should hang, and Henry knocked the garland down twice and was profoundly annoyed about it. And there was some crumbling and some things that didn't go where they were supposed to go. And by the end, the mantel looked like Christmas, as interpreted by 5 children with different opinions, which was not quite orderly, but which was real. Caleb came in that evening and stopped in the doorway of the main room and looked at the mantel. Eleanor was in the kitchen doorway, watching. He stood there for a long time. She saw the moment when something in him moved, a small, almost invisible thing, a tightening and then a releasing, like a fist opening. He reached out and straightened the garland slightly, just one section of it that had drooped, and then he stood back. "Looks good," he said, to the room in general, to no one in particular. Nobody answered because there were no children in the room to answer, but May came running in from the kitchen at that moment, as she frequently did from no discernible cause, and she stopped when she saw her father standing there looking at the mantel. "We decorated," she announced. "I can see that," Caleb said. Eleanor helped. "Did she?" She said, "The bells go on the door, but George wanted them on the window and I wanted them on the door too. But George said, I only wanted it because Eleanor said it." Caleb looked down at his daughter. Something shifted in his face. Something that was almost, for one brief moment, something warmer. "Where'd the bells end up?" he asked. May pointed at the door, triumphant. "Good place for them," Caleb said. May, having delivered a report, ran back to the kitchen. Caleb stood in the main room alone for another moment, looking at the mantel, and then he went upstairs. Eleanor went back to the dishes. Okay, the tree went up 5 days before Christmas. Henry and George had dragged it in from the wood that morning. A spruce that was slightly lopsided on one side and too tall by 6 inches and absolutely perfect. And they spent the better part of an hour arguing about how to stand it up straight, which Eleanor helped solve by using a wedge of scrap wood at the base, in a way that was not beautiful, but was functional, which was a solution she'd come to appreciate. They decorated it that evening with what they had, which was not much. More of the carved ornaments, some tied bows Clara made from scraps of ribbon, a string of buttons threaded on twine that May had found in Eleanor's sewing kit and had inexplicably decided were appropriate tree decorations. Clara made a paper star for the top, which was slightly too small but which she fixed to the topmost branch with the determination that foreclosed any comment. It was a lopsided tree with a paper star and button garlands, and it was, Eleanor thought, one of the most sincere Christmas trees she had ever seen. They were still gathered around it when Caleb came in from the evening barn rounds, later than usual because one of the horses had been restless. He came through the main room and stopped. He stood in the doorway, and he looked at the tree, and he looked at his children, all 5 of them, spread around it in various positions. May already half asleep in Nora's lap, George explaining to Henry about the precise aerodynamic properties of the paper star. And he stood there for a long moment that had a particular quality to it. Eleanor was sitting in the chair by the window, slightly apart from the rest of them. She saw his face. She saw the particular way a man looks when he sees something he thought he'd lost. He didn't say anything. He pulled a chair from the wall and sat down near the fire. Not in the middle of things, but not outside them either. The closest he'd been, physically, to the center of his family in what she suspected was a long time. He didn't speak. But he sat there, and the children orbited around him in their various ways. And after a while, George came and leaned against his father's knee without asking, and Caleb didn't move away. He sat there with his hand resting on the back of his son's shoulder, not quite holding him, and Eleanor looked out the window at the snow. She was in a place she had not expected to be in. The feeling in her was complicated and quiet, and she didn't try to name it because naming it felt premature, felt like the kind of thing that could frighten something fragile into flight. But it was there. Christmas Eve, Eleanor stayed up late making a soup from the beef bones she'd been saving and the root vegetables and a dried herb she'd found at the bottom of the spice shelf, and she made a second batch of gingerbread because May had asked for it 3 times and Eleanor had said maybe all 3 times, which meant yes, as May had apparently correctly intuited. She was at the stove when she heard the footstep behind her. She turned, expecting one of the children. It was Caleb. He was in his work shirt, no coat, and he looked like a man who hadn't been able to sleep and had come downstairs without quite deciding to. "Sit down," Eleanor said. "There's tea if you want it." He sat down, which was not something she'd entirely expected. She poured him a cup and set it in front of him and went back to the stove. They were quiet for a while. The soup was going steadily, and the gingerbread was not in yet, and the kitchen was warm and full of the smell of both, and outside the snow was falling lightly, less fierce than it had been. "The kids seem—" He stopped, started again. "They seem better." "They're good kids," Eleanor said. "They are," he said. A pause. "Nora especially. She's kept everything running. I know she has." "She has," Eleanor said, and she kept her voice neutral, which was a choice she made carefully. She was not going to say too long, or she shouldn't have had to, because he knew that already, and saying it would be accusation dressed as observation, and that wasn't what she was about. He seemed to hear what she didn't say anyway. He wrapped both hands around the cup. "I haven't been—" He stopped again. There was something difficult happening in him, some internal effort at language that didn't come easily. "I haven't been here. I know that. I've been here, but not present," Eleanor said. "I know." He looked at her. "You knew before I told you." "It was visible," she said simply. Another silence. The soup moved slowly. "I don't know how to—" He stopped. "I don't know how to be the thing they need me to be right now." "You don't have to know how yet," Eleanor said. "You just have to try. That's a different thing." He was quiet for a long time. "You've been good with them," he said finally. The words came out careful, like he was handing something over. "They're not hard to be good with," she said. "They're hungry for it. All of them." He looked at the table. "Thank you," he said. "For staying. I didn't—" A pause. "I didn't want you here at first." "I know," Eleanor said. "I still don't know what to do with you," he said, and it came out more honest than she thought he'd intended, rough at the edges, the words of a man not used to saying things straight. Eleanor set the wooden spoon on the rest and looked at him. "You don't have to do anything with me tonight," she said. "It's Christmas Eve. Sit there and drink your tea." He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face was working towards something she thought might, given time, become a smile. He drank his tea. She finished the gingerbread and slid it into the oven, and they sat in companionable quiet while the house slept around them, and the soup went on simmering, and the snow came down outside the window, soft now, like it had finally decided to be gentle. She didn't know what was coming. She didn't know what he was going to decide, or what she was going to decide, or whether any of this was going to resolve into something that made sense. She didn't know if the fragile thing she'd felt building in this house over 2 weeks was strong enough to hold against whatever came next. But the children were sleeping upstairs with gifts waiting for them, and there was food in the larder for the first time in months, and the tree was standing crooked in the main room with its paper star and its button garlands, and Caleb Dawson was sitting at his own kitchen table on Christmas Eve, present, awake, drinking tea in the company of another person. It wasn't everything, but it was more than had been here before. Eleanor got up to check on the gingerbread, and behind her, very quietly, Caleb Dawson said, "Merry Christmas, Miss Whitmore." She didn't turn around. She kept her face toward the oven. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Dawson," she said. The soup simmered, the snow fell. Upstairs, all 5 children slept. Christmas came and went, and the house was different after it. Not transformed. Eleanor was too practical a woman to use that word. And she'd seen enough of life to be suspicious of transformations that happened cleanly or all at once. But different in the way a room is different when someone opens a window that's been shut too long. The same walls, the same furniture, the same light coming through the same glass. Just air moving through it again. May had woken on Christmas morning at an hour that was barely morning at all, and had come downstairs to find her gifts with a quiet, wondering seriousness that broke something open in Eleanor's chest. She hadn't torn into things the way some children did. She'd sat on the floor and looked at the small decorated box, the wooden puzzle, the hair ribbon Clara had added last minute, and she'd held each thing with both hands like she was learning the weight of it, like she wanted to make sure it was real. Caleb had come downstairs to find all 5 of his children in the main room, and he had stood in the doorway for a moment that was long enough to notice, and then he'd sat down on the floor. Actually on the floor, which Eleanor suspected was not something he'd done in a very long time, and helped May with the puzzle pieces. And nobody made a thing of it, and that was right. The soup from Christmas Eve lasted 2 days. The gingerbread lasted until George ate the last piece on the afternoon of the 26th, and reported this fact to the room with the solemn expression of someone delivering difficult news. The new year came in quietly. No celebration, but no avoidance either. They stayed up past midnight without planning to, the whole family and Eleanor, because Henry had started telling a long story about something that had happened in the summer with a runaway steer, and it kept going, and nobody wanted to leave before it ended. And when midnight passed, they all noticed it together, and Caleb said, "Well," and May said, "Happy New Year." And the way she said it, with complete seriousness, the way 4-year-olds say things they've heard adults say, made Henry laugh. And the laugh was so sudden and so genuine that it startled everyone else into laughing too, and for a moment the kitchen was full of it. That was January. The cold deepened in the weeks that followed. Montana in deep winter was not a thing Eleanor had been prepared for. Not the scale of it, the way the cold wasn't just weather, but a physical presence, something you negotiated with daily. The temperature dropped until the water in the wash basin froze overnight, and the horse's breath hung in clouds in the barn, and the woodpile shrank faster than she was comfortable with. Caleb and Henry cut more wood. Eleanor learned in those weeks how much of the ranch's daily life in winter was simply the management of cold, keeping things warm enough, keeping pipes from freezing, keeping animals from suffering it. She learned it by watching and then by doing, because watching without doing was not something she was constitutionally able to sustain for long. She started going out to the barn in the mornings. Not every morning. There were plenty of mornings when the children needed her inside, and she was not going to pretend she had any particular skill with cattle that she didn't have. But she went out when she could, and she learned the names of the animals, which were a mix of functional names Caleb had given them, and names the children had given them that were considerably more expressive. There was a heifer named Biscuit, George's work, and a horse called Temperance, who was named ironically, according to Henry, because she had none. There was a barn cat named Captain who was missing an ear and who regarded Eleanor with the particular disdain of a cat who has decided the world is beneath him. Caleb was always already in the barn when she arrived. They fell into a pattern that was not quite conversation, but was more than silence. He would tell her what needed doing, briefly and practically, and she would do what she could do, and they would work alongside each other in the barn's cold quiet. And occasionally one of them would say something and the other would respond, and it was the kind of talk that wasn't about anything important. And was, because of that, more intimate than anything deliberate. "Temperance favors her right front this morning," Eleanor said one day, early February. Caleb looked up from the stall he was clearing. "Since when?" "I noticed it when she came in from the paddock." He set down the pitchfork and went to look. He lifted the hoof and examined it, and Eleanor watched him work. The competence of it, the steady, unhurried way he handled the animal, speaking to her in a low voice the whole time. "Stone bruise," he said. "She'll be all right. I'll poultice it tonight." "I can do it," Eleanor said. "If you show me how." He looked at her. "You want to learn to poultice a horse?" "I want to be useful," she said, "and I'm going to be here, so." There it was, the statement she'd been not quite making for weeks. "I'm going to be here." Said plainly, without drama, because drama was not her register, and because she'd learned that plain things landed better with Caleb Dawson than anything wrapped up. He looked at her for a moment. Then he showed her how to poultice the horse. The change in him was not linear. She wanted to be honest about that, even to herself. It was not a steady progression from closed to open, from grief to something livable. It was more like weather, a warm day followed by 3 cold ones, a clearing that lasted a week, and then a storm that made you forget the clearing had happened. There were days he was present, in the kitchen in the evenings, talking to the children, and occasionally to her, and there was something in him those days that was recognizably the man Nora and Henry had described, the one who used to laugh and bring them to the barn for calf births. There were other days he went somewhere she couldn't reach, somewhere interior, and shuddered, and he would move through the house without making contact with anything. And the children would go quieter without knowing why, adjusting themselves to his weather the way they had learned to do. On one of the good days, he found her in the storage room sorting through a crate of old things that needed organizing. She organized things when she was thinking. It was a habit she'd had since childhood. And he stood in the doorway and said, without preamble, "Sarah used to do that." Eleanor looked up. It was the first time he had said his wife's name directly to her. "Do what?" she asked. "Sort things when she was working something out in her head. Couldn't just sit and think. Had to have her hands moving." Eleanor looked at the crate. "It helps," she said. "Keeps the thinking from circling." That's what she said. He was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the crate, not at Eleanor, and she had the sense he was somewhere slightly else. She was good at making things work, practical, like you. Eleanor did not say anything. "I'm not comparing you," he said quickly. "I'm not trying to—" "I didn't think you were," she said. He nodded. He stood in the doorway for another moment, and she thought he was going to leave, but instead he came in and crouched by the crate and started helping her sort, and they worked in quiet for 20 minutes, and he didn't say anything else about Sarah, and Eleanor didn't ask. But something had passed between them that hadn't before. A name, given. A door, opened a crack. It was mid-February when she understood that she was in trouble. She was in the kitchen when Caleb came back from the south pasture. He'd been checking fence. And he was cold, and there was snow in his hair, and his coat was wet at the shoulders. And without thinking, she turned from the stove and handed him a towel and said, "Sit down. I'll heat this up," meaning the coffee that had been sitting on the back of the stove. And he took the towel and sat, and she brought the coffee and went back to what she was making for supper. And none of that was remarkable. What was remarkable was the moment that followed, which was just the two of them in the kitchen in the late afternoon winter light, Caleb warming his hands on the cup and Eleanor at the stove, and the ease of it. The way it felt like something that had always been like this. The way she caught herself not wanting it to stop. She kept her face toward the stove for longer than necessary. She had been careful, these weeks, not to want things she wasn't sure she was allowed to want. She had come here under false pretenses. Someone else's false pretenses, but still. And she had stayed on the understanding that this was practical, that she was useful, that she was here for the children and the household and not for herself. That was what she'd told herself, and she'd believed it mostly. But there were things she'd noticed that she hadn't fully admitted to noticing. The way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't paying attention. Not quite the way you looked at someone useful, more the way you looked at something you were trying to understand. The way he had started arriving in the kitchen earlier in the evenings, as though he'd found reasons not to stay in the barn. The way he'd started talking to her. Not much, not easily, but more than before, in the way of a man who was testing whether words were still something he could use. She had noticed all of this and had not decided what to do with it, and the safest answer had been to keep her head down and keep working and not let herself follow the thread of what it might mean. That became harder in February. The particular evening that broke her composure was not dramatic. It was ordinary in almost every way, which was the thing about it. Caleb had spent the day helping a neighbor retrieve a wagon that had gone off the road 2 miles east, and he came back later than expected, cold and tired, and not in a bad way, but visibly worn down. The children had already eaten. Eleanor had kept a plate warm. She set it in front of him, and he looked at it and said quietly, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said, and sat down across from him while he ate, because the kitchen was cold on the other side and the stove was here, which was the reason she gave herself. He ate, and she had her tea, and after a while he said, "Tell me something about Ohio." She looked at him. "What do you want to know?" "Anything. I've never been east of the Dakotas." So she told him. She told him about Millbrook, about the particular flatness of it in winter, about the elm trees on the main street that had been there long enough to make a canopy over the road, about the way the river froze shallow every January, and the children skated on it in a way that alarmed their parents, but never quite resulted in the disaster everyone expected. She told him about her schoolroom, the children she'd taught, the particular exhaustions and pleasures of trying to get a 12-year-old who does not want to learn arithmetic to learn arithmetic. He listened. He ate. He asked questions. Not many, but specific ones. The questions of someone who was actually following and not just waiting for silence. At one point she said something funny about a former student, the same story she'd told the children, the one about the boy who spelled his own name wrong 3 times. And Caleb laughed. A real one, brief and low but genuine, and she felt it in a way she was not entirely prepared for. She looked at her tea. "You're good at that," he said. "At what?" "Telling things. Making them real. The way you talk about places, I can see them." He seemed slightly surprised to be saying this. "Sarah used to say I talked about things like I was giving a weather report." Eleanor smiled a little. "That's not entirely untrue." He looked at her, and there was something in his expression she hadn't seen before, something that was aware, that was looking at her specifically, that was not the distant, generalized attention of a man going through the motions. "I'm sorry, Tzik," he said, "for the way I was when you first came." She hadn't expected that. "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to. I want to." He put his fork down. "You came here in good faith and I made it. I wasn't kind to you. I know that." "You were grieving," Eleanor said. "That's not an excuse." "No," she agreed. "But it is a reason. There's a difference." He looked at her for a long moment. In the quiet of the kitchen, with the fire low and the children upstairs, and the night outside the window deep and cold, the distance between them felt like something she could measure. "Eleanor," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She met his eyes. There was a moment, just a moment, a beat of silence that had a particular held quality to it, a moment in which something was close enough to name. And then May's voice came from the top of the stairs, high and alarmed. "Nora, I had a bad dream." Eleanor stood up. "I'll go," she said, because she was closer to the stairs and because she needed to move, and she went, and the moment closed behind her. She didn't sleep well that night. She lay in the small room and listened to the house settle and thought about the way he had said her name, the way his voice had sounded. Careful, like something he'd been holding and finally set down. She was not a woman who dramatized things. She had lived 31 years on the understanding that the careful management of expectation was how you kept yourself intact. She had learned that early, after her mother died, and had reinforced it over years of watching herself hope for things and not get them. The letters, Nora's letters, had been an anomaly, a moment of uncharacteristic faith, and look at where that had landed her. And yet here she was. Here she was, in a cold room in Montana, unable to sleep because a man she had known for 8 weeks had said her name in a quiet kitchen. And the thing that frightened her was not that it had happened, but that she had been waiting for it to happen without admitting it to herself. She liked him. That was the plain of it, stripped of complication. She liked the way he worked. She liked the roughness of his speech and the places where something more careful pushed through it. She liked the way he was with his children when he let himself be present. The hand on George's shoulder, the quiet attention to May. She liked that he was trying, She liked that he knew he'd been somewhere unreachable and was working, without fanfare, to come back. She liked that he had laughed at her story. She was in trouble, and she knew it, and she also knew the specific danger of it. She was a woman who had come here under false premises, who was here on a temporary understanding with no real security, and who had, in 8 weeks, allowed herself to feel something that could only be a problem if it wasn't returned, and a different kind of problem if it was. She fell asleep around 2 in the morning and woke when it was still dark, and she got up and started breakfast, because that was what there was to do. Things shifted after that evening, in ways that were small and unmistakable. He started talking to her, not just the practical exchange of information, not just the barnwork dialogue. He started talking to her the way you talk to someone you wanted to talk to, at the kitchen table in the evenings, sometimes briefly, sometimes for longer. He told her things about the ranch, about the land, about what had been and what he wanted it to be. He told her once about a valley 2 hours' ride south that he'd found years ago before Sarah died, where the grass grew so thick in summer that you could lose a dog in it, and he had taken the family there for a picnic and the children had run in it until they were exhausted, and he described it with a specificity and a warmth that told her it was a place he visited often in his mind. "You should take them again," she said, "in the summer." He was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "Maybe." She noticed that he no longer retreated to the barn immediately after supper. He stayed, sometimes for an hour, and he was not yet comfortable with it. She could see him occasionally catch himself staying and look almost surprised, but he stayed. She noticed that he listened when she talked to the children, with an attention that was not passive, that he would sometimes, the next day, follow up on something she had said the evening before. Not obviously, but she caught it. She noticed, and she was careful, and she was also human, and it was becoming harder to be careful. Well, the thing broke in March. It had been a good week, a genuinely good week, the kind that reminded Eleanor why she had stayed, why staying had ever seemed like an idea that made sense. Caleb had taken Henry and George out to check the south fence and had come back with both boys animated and full of something that had happened involving a coyote and a fence post, and he'd told the story over supper with something close to ease, and the children had all been talking at once, and Nora had been laughing, actually laughing, with the uncomplicated quality of a girl who had briefly stopped being the responsible one. Eleanor had sat across from Caleb at the table, and he had caught her eye at the moment when May knocked her cup sideways and grabbed for it and caught it, and they had both been half a second from reaching to help. And the look they exchanged was just the look of two people noticing the same thing at the same time. The look of people who are in something together. She did not know what was on her face in that moment. She only knew that he held her gaze for a second longer than the moment required. After the children were in bed, Nora went up early. She had been tired, worn down by a cold she'd been carrying for a week, and Eleanor and Caleb were alone in the kitchen. He was at the table. She was at the stove. The pattern of weeks, familiar now. "Good day," he said. "Yes," she said. It was. He was quiet. She heard him shift in the chair. Then, "Eleanor." She turned. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something open and undefended, and also, underneath it, something that was afraid. He looked like a man who had been working up to saying something and had decided to say it before he thought himself out of it. "I don't know what this is," he said. His voice was low and careful. "What's happening between us? I don't—" He stopped. I haven't felt much of anything in 2 years. I'd gotten used to it, and now He looked at his hands. "It scares me. That's the honest thing." Eleanor stood at the stove and looked at him. Her heart was doing something inconvenient. "It scares me too," she said. He looked up. "I didn't come here for this," she said. "I came here because I had nowhere else to go, and a 13-year-old wrote me a very persuasive letter. I didn't plan—" She stopped. "I didn't plan any of this." "No," he said. "Neither did I." They looked at each other across the kitchen, and the thing between them was real and named now and therefore more dangerous than when it had been neither. "I don't know what I can offer you," he said. I don't know if I'm capable of—" He seemed to be searching for the word. "Of doing this right. I don't have a good record of being present. You know that better than most. You've been present, she said, these last weeks. That's recent. That's what matters, she said. Not what came before. What you're doing now. He was quiet for a long moment. She thought something was working itself out in him, some calculation or decision or fear navigating itself. Sarah, he started. You don't have to explain her to me, Eleanor said. She was your wife. You loved her. That's not something I'm asking you to put somewhere. He looked at her. Something in his face shifted. He stood up from the table slowly, and he crossed the kitchen, and he stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to look up at him, and she could see everything he was feeling because he wasn't, in this moment, hiding any of it. He lifted a hand and she thought, but instead he just touched her face briefly, his thumb at her jaw. And it lasted only a second, and then he stepped back like he'd been burned, and he turned and walked to the door and took his coat from the hook. I need, he said, not turning around. I need to think. He went out. Eleanor stood at the stove with her hand pressed flat against the kitchen counter. She could feel where he had touched her jaw as clearly as though he had left a mark there. She stood there for a while, alone in the kitchen, and she thought about careful and about need and about the specific difficulty of wanting something you don't quite trust yourself to have. He avoided her for 3 days. Not completely. He still came in, still sat at meals, still did everything he was supposed to do. But there was a distance in him again that hadn't been there in weeks. Something pulled back and reshuttered. Eleanor gave him the space. She did not chase it, did not probe, did not ask. She kept on with the household and the children and the barn, and she was steady because steadiness was what she had. But she was watching, and what she saw in those 3 days troubled her in a way she hadn't anticipated. He was not just creating distance from her. He was retreating into the old version of himself, the one that went through the days, that was present in body only. She saw it in the way the children looked at him and looked away. She saw it in the slight shadow that came back over Nora's face. He was not just afraid of her. He was afraid of what she had made him feel. And she understood that. She understood it. She even had compassion for it. But she also understood, watching the children adjust themselves to his weather again, that the cost of his fear was not only his to pay. On the 4th day, he came to her. He found her in the side yard splitting kindling. It was one of the tasks she'd added to her regular rotation because the woodpile inside the kitchen needed constant replenishment, and Henry couldn't always be spared for it. He came and took the axe from her, not roughly, just with the matter-of-fact authority of a man who had decided to do something. She let him. She stood back. He split several pieces before he said anything. I've been thinking, he said. I noticed, she said. I'm not good at this. He split another piece. At letting people in. I wasn't even particularly good at it before. She had patience with me. He set down another piece, lined it up. I keep thinking that he split it. If I let this mean something, and then something happens, if I lose, he stopped. Eleanor waited. I can't do it again, he said. That's what I keep coming back to. I can't go through that again. I don't have it in me. I know, she said. He looked at her. I know that's what you're afraid of, she said. And I can't promise you it won't happen. I can't promise you anything about the future. Nobody can. She paused. But I can tell you that you're already losing things, Caleb. Every day you stay behind that wall, you lose another day with your children. Another day of being here instead of just occupying space. He was very still. I'm not asking you to stop being afraid, she said. I'm asking you whether you're going to let the fear make the decision. He looked at her for a long time. Something was moving in his face, not settled yet, not resolved. He was a man at the edge of something, and she could not tell which way he was going to step. Then he set the axe against the woodpile. I need more time, he said. All right, she said. He nodded once and went back inside. Eleanor stood in the cold side yard, and she thought that more time was not nothing. More time was a door that hadn't been closed. More time was a man who was still fighting with himself instead of just walking away. She picked up the axe and kept splitting. 3 days later, he came into the kitchen while she was teaching May her letters, sat down at the table, and said, in the tone of someone who has spent days arriving at a decision, I'd like you to stay. Not just through winter. I'd like... He stopped. Tried again. I'd like you to stay. May looked up from her letters. She already lives here, she informed her father. May, Eleanor said. She does, May said, with the complete reasonableness of a 4-year-old who does not understand why adults complicate obvious things. Caleb looked at his daughter for a moment. Then he looked at Eleanor. I know I'm not easy, he said. I know that too, she said. I'm trying. I can see that. They looked at each other across the kitchen table, with May between them drawing letters on her slate with her tongue between her teeth in concentration. Okay, Eleanor said. I'll stay. He let out a breath. Slow, not quite relief, but close to it. He reached over and looked at May's letters, upside down from where he sat, and said, Your E is backwards. I like it that way, May said. That's not how an E goes. It is how my E goes. He looked at Eleanor with an expression that was helpless and fond and exhausted all at once. She argues, he said. I've noticed, Eleanor said. He almost smiled. He turned back to May and started, with the deliberate patience of a man who had been away from this for too long and was finding his way back, to show her how an E went. Eleanor went to the stove and kept her face toward it for a moment, because what was on her face was hers, and she wasn't ready to share it. Outside, the last of the winter light was going gold on the snow, and the house was full of small sounds. The scratch of a slate pencil, a low voice patient with a stubborn child, the particular hum that a house makes when something in it is working the way it was meant to. But underneath the warmth of it, in the part of her that stayed careful even when she didn't want to, Eleanor felt it. The thing that comes before trouble, the sense of something pulled too tight. He had said he needed more time. He had said he was trying. And she believed him. She did. She just didn't yet know if trying would be enough. For 3 weeks after Caleb said, I'd like you to stay, things were better. Not perfect. Eleanor had stopped expecting perfect somewhere around the 2nd week of December, and she thought that was probably the right instinct. But better in ways that were real and measurable. He came to the table for meals without being called. He asked the children questions about their days and listened to the answers. He helped May with her letters in the evenings, patiently, and sometimes with visible frustration that he kept managed. And May corrected him on things with the absolute confidence of a child who does not yet understand that she might be wrong. And he bore this with something that was almost amusement. He and Eleanor did not talk directly about what had happened in the kitchen, about the touch at her jaw or the things said in the cold side yard. There was an understanding between them that was not yet language, a carefulness on both sides, a mutual awareness that whatever this was, it was fragile enough that pushing at it directly might break it before it had the chance to become something solid. Eleanor told herself this was fine. She believed it mostly. She watched him find his way back to his children in increments, awkward sometimes, uncertain, occasionally retreating for a day and then coming back. And she thought this was what it looked like when a person chose to be present again. It wasn't graceful. It was someone relearning how to walk after a long time of not walking, and it looked exactly like that. Henry started talking to his father again. Genuinely talking, not the clipped functional exchanges they'd been having for 2 years, but the kind of conversation that went sideways and took longer than expected. She overheard them one evening in the barn. She'd come to check on Temperance's hoof, which had finally healed properly, talking about the south fence and whether to extend it, and Henry had an opinion, and Caleb listened to it with genuine attention and then disagreed with part of it and explained why. And Henry pushed back, and it was an argument, but the kind of argument that meant both people were taking each other seriously, and she went back to the house without interrupting it. Nora, who had the most to lose and the longest memory of losing things, was the most careful. She watched. She did not relax the way the younger ones were beginning to relax. She was still the one who made sure the kitchen was ready in the morning and the fire was going and the younger ones were fed and dressed, not because she had to be anymore, but because the habit of it was 2 years deep, and habits didn't release that easily. Eleanor worked, slowly and deliberately, to take things from her, not abruptly, not in a way that made Nora feel displaced, but steadily, redistributing the weight so that Nora could begin to remember that she was 13, not 30. You don't have to do that, Nora said one morning when Eleanor was already at the stove before Nora had come down. I know, Eleanor said. I wanted to. Nora stood in the kitchen doorway in her nightdress, her dark hair loose, looking younger than she usually managed to look. She said, "Is it strange that I still worry it's going to stop?" Eleanor looked at her. "No," she said. "It's not strange at all. I keep waiting for something to go wrong," Nora said. "I know that probably sounds... It sounds like someone who has had things go wrong before," Eleanor said. "That's all it sounds like." Nora looked at her for a moment. "Are you going to stay?" she asked. "Really stay, not just through winter." "That's what I intend," Eleanor said. "What does my father intend?" Eleanor turned back to the stove. "You'd have to ask him that." She heard Nora make a small sound that was not quite satisfied, and then she heard her go back upstairs to dress, and Eleanor stood at the stove and thought, yes, what does he intend? She had been not asking herself that question for 3 weeks. The trouble came on a Tuesday in late March, the way trouble often came, not announced, not dramatic, arriving sideways from a direction nobody was watching. A woman named Mrs. Aldred came to the ranch. Eleanor had seen her once before, in Harlow, when Caleb had taken her to town for supplies in February. She was the wife of the man who ran the dry goods store, and she was the kind of woman who moved through a small town as though she owned the information it contained, which in some ways she did. She had looked at Eleanor in the store with a particular attentiveness, the look of someone cataloging a situation for future use. She arrived at the ranch on Tuesday morning with a cake. A very good cake. Eleanor would give her that. A proper layered thing wrapped in cloth, and a neighbor's friendly expression that had, underneath it, the precise social sharpness of a woman who had a purpose. Eleanor answered the door because she was closest to it, and Mrs. Aldred's expression did something small and controlled when she saw her. "I came to see Caleb," she said, "and the children, of course. I heard there was a woman staying, from the east." "Ohio," Eleanor said. "Come in." She made tea because it was what you did, and she brought the cake to the kitchen and called the children, and Caleb came in from outside and stopped when he saw Mrs. Aldred sitting at his kitchen table. "Helen," he said. His voice was careful. "Caleb," she smiled. "I've been meaning to come for weeks. I heard you had help." She looked at Eleanor with the same cataloging attention. "It's good that you have someone looking after the house. The children must be glad of it." The particular way she said someone landed somewhere specific. Eleanor picked up her tea. The visit lasted an hour, and most of it was ordinary. Helen Aldred asking after the cattle, after the children's health, after the state of the south pasture. She was not unpleasant. She was in fact skilled at conversation in the way of someone who had spent decades maintaining a social position in a small place. But Eleanor watched Caleb through it, and she watched what happened to him. He contracted. That was the word for it. He became careful and distant in the way of a man being observed, being assessed, and the ease that had been growing in him over these weeks pulled back like water from a shore. When Helen Aldred left, she said at the door, with a smile that was perfectly calibrated, "Caleb, you must come to dinner sometime. Bring the children. Bring—" A small pause, a glance at Eleanor. "Everyone, of course." After she was gone, Caleb stood in the kitchen and didn't say anything for a moment. "She means well," he said, finally, which was the thing people said about people who didn't mean well, but whose ill meaning was too socially complex to address directly. "Of course," Eleanor said. He looked at her. There was something in his face she hadn't seen in weeks, the shuttered quality, the drawing in. "I should get back to the fence," he said. He went out. She told herself it was one visit, that one difficult hour did not undo weeks of careful progress. She told herself to be patient, which was a thing she was generally good at, but the week that followed told a different story. He was not cold. That was the thing she kept coming back to, trying to understand. He was not cold, not distant in the way of anger or rejection. He was just gone again. The version of him that had been finding its way back to the table, to the barn conversations, to the evenings where he sat near the fire while the children talked, that version went quiet. He was doing what he had always done, going through the days, being present in body and somewhere else in everything that mattered. She noticed it. The children noticed it. Nora noticed it most acutely, and Eleanor saw it in the way Nora's face reset itself into the expression she'd had in December. watchful, braced, the face of someone who has been here before and knows the terrain. Eleanor did not confront him. She had said what she had to say in the side yard, and she had meant it, and she was not going to repeat herself. But she was watching, and what she was watching was a man being consumed by his own fear, and the children paying the price of it alongside her. She thought about leaving. She thought about it seriously for the first time in weeks, not as an abstraction, not as the background option she'd maintained for her own sense of agency, but as an actual thing she might do. She lay in the small room off the kitchen, and she thought, you can leave. You have enough money now for a ticket. You could go somewhere else. Start something else. You're 31, not dead. She thought about Nora's face in the pantry, about May's weight on her back in the snow, about Henry in the barn talking to the heifer because he had things to say and no one to say them to, about George's Fox notebook, about Clara's careful sideways trust. She thought about Caleb's hand at her jaw and the specific way her name had sounded in his voice in the quiet kitchen. She didn't sleep much. It was Nora who broke it open. It was a Saturday, a week and a half after Mrs. Aldred's visit, and Caleb had spent the day outside doing work that didn't require it, which Eleanor had come to understand was what he did when he was avoiding something. He came in at supper time and sat at the table and ate with the expression of a man elsewhere, and the children ate around him in the particular subdued way they had, and the kitchen was too quiet. After supper, Eleanor took May upstairs to bed, and when she came back down, the kitchen was empty. She could hear Caleb in the main room. She started the washing up. She heard voices. She didn't intend to listen. She was at the sink with the water going, and she wasn't positioned to hear clearly. But then the water went quiet, and the voices were distinct. Nora's voice. Papa, I want to talk to you. A pause. Nora, it's late. It's 8 o'clock. Another pause. Eleanor set down what she was holding and stood very still. You're doing it again, Nora said. Her voice was steady in the way it was when she was making herself be steady on purpose. You're going away. I can see it. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. You do the same thing you did after Mama died. You're here, but you're not. You're not in it. You stopped coming to the table the same way. You stopped. She stopped. Started again. It's been 2 years, Papa. 2 years of us trying to hold it together and you not being there to hold it with us. And then Eleanor came and things were different. You were different. I could see you coming back, and now you're leaving again for no reason I can see. Silence. What happened? Nora said. What happened that made you go back into that? Nothing happened, he said. His voice was careful. Mrs. Aldred came, Nora said flatly. A longer silence. I don't know what you're implying, Caleb said. I'm not implying anything, Nora said. I'm saying that she came, and she looked at Eleanor the way people in town look at Eleanor, like she's something temporary, something that doesn't quite belong. And after that, you started disappearing again. And I want to know if that's a coincidence or if you're letting what other people think make your decisions for you. Eleanor pressed her back against the kitchen wall. She could feel her own heartbeat. You're 13, Caleb said. This isn't... I know how old I am, Nora said, and something in her voice shifted, became something rawer than steady. I've known how old I am every single day for the past 2 years while I've been doing things a 13-year-old shouldn't have to do. I know exactly how old I am. And I'm telling you that you are about to lose the best thing that has happened to this family since Mama died, and you're going to lose it because you're scared, and I can't... Her voice broke. Just once. At the edge of the word, and then she pulled it back. I can't watch you do that. The silence in the main room had a particular quality to it. Eleanor stood in the kitchen and didn't move. Nora, we need her, Nora said. I know I wasn't supposed to write to her. I know it was wrong, and I knew it was wrong when I did it, and I'd do it again. Because I was watching you and watching this family, and I was so scared, Papa. I was scared we were just going to keep going like that forever, getting smaller, getting quieter, until there was nothing left. Her voice was steadier now, which was somehow more devastating than if it had broken. And she came and she didn't have to stay, and she stayed anyway. She stayed because of us. Because she could see what we needed and she decided we were worth staying for. And you're about to throw that away because you're afraid of what Mrs. Aldred thinks. Or because you're afraid of feeling something. Or because... She stopped. Because you think if you love something, it'll die. The silence after this was long enough that Eleanor thought for a moment it was over, that Caleb had walked out of the room, that nothing else was going to be said. Then she heard Caleb's voice, and it was wrecked in a way she'd never heard it, low and broken at the edges. Nora. I know, Papa. I know you know. A pause. A long one. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry that you've had to... I don't want you to be sorry, Nora said. I want you to do something about it. Eleanor had moved to the kitchen table by the time she heard footsteps in the hall. Not Caleb's, but multiple sets of feet, and she understood that somehow all 5 of them were in the main room, had been in it, or had drifted there during the course of what had happened. Henry's voice, lower than Nora's. She's right, Papa. We all see it. Clara, who rarely spoke at volume in situations of tension. May asked me last week if Eleanor was going to leave like Mama left. She didn't understand it wasn't the same kind of leaving. She knows things are different and she's scared. A long pause. George, I showed her my Fox notebook. She's the only person who thought it was worth keeping. Another silence. I know, Caleb said. His voice was very quiet. Then why? Henry started. I know, Caleb said again, and there was something in the repetition of it that was not dismissal, but the specific tone of a man saying, I hear you. Stop. I know. The tone of someone whose internal structure was engaged in something that didn't leave room for more input right now. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the wood. She heard a chair move. She heard footsteps, and they were Caleb's, and they crossed the main room, and then she heard them on the stairs, going up, not coming to the kitchen. And she heard them cross the floor above, and then nothing. The children came into the kitchen. Nora looked at Eleanor. Her eyes were red at the rims, which was the only evidence of what had just happened. Her face was composed, because Nora's face was almost always composed, but the red at the rims gave it away. He heard us, Nora said. It wasn't quite a question. I imagine so, Eleanor said. Are you leaving? Eleanor looked at her. Not tonight, she said. Nora sat down at the table. Henry sat across from her. Clara came and stood behind Eleanor's chair in that particular way she had. Not quite initiating contact, close enough that the presence of another person was available if she needed it. George sat on the bench by the stove and pulled his knees up. They were all exhausted in the way of people who have said difficult true things, the particular tiredness of honesty. He's been afraid for a long time, Eleanor said. That doesn't excuse it, but it's true. I know it's true, Nora said. I've known it was true for 2 years. It doesn't make it better when we're the ones it costs. No, Eleanor agreed. It doesn't. They sat in the kitchen for a while, all 5 of them and Eleanor, and nobody said much. And it was not comfortable exactly, but it was together, and that was something. Eleanor made hot milk for the younger ones and sent them to bed, and Nora went up not long after, and Henry last, pausing at the foot of the stairs. You should stay, he said. He was looking at his boots, not at her. I intend to, Eleanor said, for what it's worth. He looked up then, briefly, with the expression of a boy trying to decide whether to trust something. Then he nodded once and went up. Eleanor sat alone in the kitchen. The fire had gone low. She built it up, and she sat with her tea, and she thought about what Nora had said. You think if you love something, it'll die. And she thought about how true it was, and how it was also not a thing that could be argued with, because fear like that didn't respond to argument. You couldn't reason someone out of a terror that wasn't rational. You could only wait and be steady and let them see that you were still there. She was still there. She didn't know if that was enough. She was still sitting at the table an hour later, not quite sleeping, her tea long cold, when she heard footsteps on the stairs. Caleb came into the kitchen. He was dressed, which told her he hadn't been sleeping either. He stopped when he saw her at the table, and something moved in his expression, something that might have been relief. You're still here, he said. I said I was staying, she said. He came and sat down across from her. He looked like a man who had spent an hour doing something hard in private. His face had the particular exhausted openness of someone who has finished fighting with himself and has come out the other side of it without yet knowing if he won or lost. He put his hands on the table. She noticed they were not quite steady. I heard what Nora said, he said. I heard it too, she said. She's right. He looked at his hands. All of it. Every part of it. She's 13 and she's more honest about what I'm doing than I've been able to be. He was quiet for a moment. I've been telling myself I was protecting them, keeping things simple, not wanting to complicate what they had with you by making it something it might not be able to sustain. He looked up. That's what I told myself. But what I was actually doing was protecting myself. Eleanor said nothing. He needed to finish. I'm terrified, he said, and the word came out without the armor usually around it, plain and undefended. That's the simple truth of it. Not of you. I'm terrified of feeling this much and losing it again, because I know what that costs. I know exactly what it costs, and I couldn't do it again. I thought I couldn't. He stopped. His jaw worked. But Nora said something. She said, you're still here because you decided we were worth staying for. And I've been so focused on what I was afraid of losing that I didn't. He stopped again. I didn't think about what I was already losing, every day, what I've been throwing away by being afraid of losing it. Eleanor sat across from him and looked at his face and thought that she had been wrong, earlier, when she'd wondered if trying would be enough. Because this was not just trying. This was a man pulling himself out of something with his hands, something he'd been buried in for 2 years, because his children had stood in front of him and told him the truth, and he had been brave enough to hear it. Eleanor, his voice was rough. I can't promise you that I won't struggle with this. I can't promise I'm going to be easy to be with. I haven't been able to promise that even to myself. I'm not asking you to promise that, she said. I know you're not, but I'm saying it because you should know it. You should know what you're agreeing to if you... He stopped. If you stay. I've been here 3 months, she said. I know who you are. You know who I'm trying to be. That's who you are, she said. The trying is who you are. He looked at her for a long moment. I don't want you to leave, he said. I want you here. I want you to be here the way you've been here. And I know that I've been... He closed his eyes briefly, opened them. I know I almost threw it away. I know I've been letting fear make choices that weren't fears to make. And I'm asking you... He paused. I'm asking if you're still willing to let me try to do this right. Eleanor looked at him. She thought about Careful, about the small room off the kitchen and the narrow bed and the letters that had brought her here, about May asking if she was going to leave like Mama left, about the gingerbread and the broken ornament and the side yard in the cold, about his name in her own voice, the first time she'd used it, and how it had felt like something crossing a threshold. Yes, she said. He let out a breath. The tension in him shifted into something else. Not gone, but changed. The tension of effort rather than resistance. He reached across the table, not quickly, and he set his hand over hers on the wood. Just that. His hand on hers, in the kitchen, in the low firelight, while the house slept. She turned her hand over under his. They sat like that for a while, not saying anything, and outside the March wind was doing its thing in the eaves, and the fire was steady. And somewhere upstairs Nora was probably not sleeping, probably lying in her bed listening for the sound of a door, for footsteps, for any evidence of which way things had fallen. Eleanor hoped she could hear the quiet. She hoped that the quality of the silence coming from the kitchen was legible to a 13-year-old girl who had learned to read silences the way some people read weather. I should go up, Caleb said finally. He didn't move his hand immediately. It's late. It is, she said. He stood. He looked at her with the particular look she'd been filing away without letting herself file. The look that was specific to her, that was looking at her, not at something useful or necessary or transitional. Tomorrow, he said. Breakfast. It was not a declaration or a proclamation. It was a man telling a woman he would see her in the morning, which was, she supposed, its own kind of promise. Tomorrow, she said. He went up. Eleanor stayed at the table for a few more minutes, in the quiet kitchen, with her hand still warm where his had been. She thought about the morning, about breakfast, about the children coming down, about the specific, unremarkable dailiness of it. She thought about how long she'd been living inside the daily texture of this place, how much of herself she'd laid down into it without quite noticing, the way you lay down tracks that slowly become a road. She got up and banked the fire. She checked the door. She went to her room and she lay down and she looked at the ceiling of the small room off the kitchen, which had been a hired hand's room and was now hers, and she thought, tomorrow. Breakfast. And outside, for the first time in weeks, the wind went quiet. Not gone, just resting, taking a breath before whatever came next. She slept. The morning after was ordinary in almost every way, and that was the thing about it that mattered most. Eleanor was at the stove when Caleb came downstairs. He came in, hung his coat on the hook, and said, "Morning." And she said, "Morning." And he went and poured himself coffee and stood at the counter drinking it, and none of that was remarkable except that the ease of it, the simple domestic fact of two people in a kitchen at the beginning of a day, was something that had been missing from this house for so long that its presence now felt like a thing worth noticing. May came down next, trailing a blanket, and went directly to Caleb and held up her arms, and he set down his coffee and picked her up without breaking the motion. And she settled against his shoulder with the complete boneless trust of a child who has decided a person is safe. And Caleb stood at the counter holding his youngest daughter and drinking his coffee. And he caught Eleanor's eye over May's head, and there was something in his look that was simple and clear and didn't need translating. George came down arguing with Henry about something that had apparently started before they left the bedroom, and Clara followed them both with the expression of someone who had been listening to this argument for longer than was reasonable, and had opinions about it that she was choosing not to share. Nora came last, and she stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the room, at her father holding May, at Eleanor at the stove, at the particular atmosphere of a morning that was different from the mornings that had come before. And something in her face did a thing that was not quite a smile and not quite relief, and was both of those things at once. She didn't say anything. She came to the table and sat down, and breakfast happened, and it was loud because George and Henry's argument spilled into the meal, and Clara eventually did share her opinion, forcefully, and May wanted to know what they were arguing about, and nobody could explain it to her satisfaction. Caleb sat at the head of his table in the middle of all of it, and he was present. That was the word for it. He was there, not just occupying the chair, not just going through the motions of a man eating breakfast with his family, but actually in it, listening to the argument, catching the thread of it, putting his hand up at a certain point and saying, "Henry, let her finish," in the voice of a father who is paying attention. Eleanor brought more coffee to the table and didn't say anything and didn't need to. Spring came to Montana the way it always did in that country, reluctantly, in fits, with several false starts that felt like promises and then took them back. There would be a week of warmth that melted the top layer of snow and turned the yard to mud, and then a hard frost that came back and made everything iron solid again, and then more melting, and then more frost, and the cycle repeated until sometime in April, when the warmth finally meant it and stayed. Eleanor learned to read the land in those weeks. She learned it the way you learn a language by immersion, not by studying it, but by living inside it, by noticing what it did and what it meant, by asking questions and making mistakes, and paying attention to what people who knew it better than she did said and did without ceremony. Caleb taught her things. This was new, not the instruction itself, which had been happening since the barn work started, but the quality of it, the unhurried willingness to explain. He showed her how to read the sky for weather the way his father had taught him, what the particular color of clouds over the western ridge meant, what it meant when the cattle bunched early, when the temperature dropped faster than normal. He showed her the south pasture fence line and which sections were sound and which were not, and why a fence built wrong in this country wasn't just a property issue but a survival issue, how a broken fence in a blizzard could cost you an entire season's cattle. He talked about the land the way people talked about things they loved, with detail and with a kind of unguarded pleasure in the talking of it. And Eleanor listened with the attention of someone who understood that when a person told you what they loved, they were telling you something true about themselves. One Saturday in April, he saddled 2 horses and took her to the valley he'd described in the kitchen months ago, the one 2 hours south where the grass grew thick in summer. The grass was not thick yet. It was April, and there were still patches of gray snow in the shadows of the hills. But she could see what it would be. She could see the shape of it, the way the land cupped the valley like hands holding something, and she understood why he carried it with him. They rode without talking much, which was comfortable in the way that silence between people is comfortable when both of them are easy in it. When they reached the valley and stopped, he looked at it for a while, and she looked at him looking at it. Sarah used to say it was the one place out here that didn't feel like it was trying to kill you, he said. She wasn't wrong, Eleanor said. He looked at her. I want to bring the kids here this summer, like I said I would. Yes, she said. You should. I want you to come, he said. When we bring them. I want you there. It was a simple thing to say. It was also not simple at all, and they both knew it. I'll be there, she said. He nodded. He looked back at the valley for a moment, and then he looked at her again, and what was in his face in that moment she thought she would keep for a long time, the openness of it, the specific quality of a man who has stopped protecting himself from the thing he wants. He leaned across the space between the horses, which required some ungainly adjustment from both animals, and he kissed her. Brief and slightly awkward because of the horses' objections to the proximity, and she laughed against his mouth because of the horses. And he pulled back and looked at her laughing, and something in him went soft in a way she hadn't seen before. Not exactly elegant, he said. No, she agreed. I've been thinking about doing that for a while, he said. I know, she said. You could have said something. So could you, she said. He considered this with the expression of a man who could not argue with it. Then Temperance shifted irritably, and the moment resolved itself back into two people on horses in an April valley, which was unglamorous and was real, and was, she thought, exactly right. The town of Harlow took its time deciding what to think about Eleanor Whitmore. Small places were like that. They had their own internal weather, their own rhythms of acceptance and resistance, and a woman arriving from Ohio under circumstances that nobody had fully clear information about, just rumors and Mrs. Aldred's careful observations, which amounted to the same thing, was the kind of situation that a small town chewed on for a while before swallowing. Eleanor was aware of being assessed. She felt it in the dry goods store and at the feed merchants and in the 2-second pauses before women greeted her when she came to town with Caleb. She was not from here. She had appeared in winter, unannounced, in a household that had been functioning on the sympathetic watchfulness of a community for 2 years. There were people who had expected, or perhaps hoped, to see Caleb Dawson find his way forward with someone they already knew, someone local, someone who had roots in the same soil. She did not pretend it didn't exist, the wariness. She did not perform friendliness she didn't feel, or work harder than necessary to be liked. She was simply herself. She answered questions directly. She said what she meant. She did not make herself smaller than she was to fit into someone else's idea of what she should be. What she did do was show up. She came to town when there was occasion to come. She was present when neighbors needed something. In May, when a family 3 miles east had a barn fire, it went fast, the way wooden structures did. She went with Caleb and the older children to help with the work of the aftermath, and she worked alongside the other women without making it a statement and without making herself invisible. And by the end of a long, hard day of it, something had shifted in the way the neighboring women spoke to her. One of them, a woman named Ruth, compact and practical, who farmed with her husband and 2 sons, came and stood beside Eleanor at the end of the day when they were cleaning up. "You're staying then," Ruth said. It was the same kind of statement that Nora had made at the depot a long time ago, not a question. "Yes," Eleanor said. Ruth looked at her assessingly. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" Ruth considered this honestly. Someone more decorative, someone who'd last 1 winter and go back. "It's a reasonable thing to have expected," Eleanor said. "Caleb seems better," Ruth said. "He came and helped us move the cattle last month. Before he would have sent Henry." She paused. "Henry's 11. "I know," Eleanor said. Ruth nodded once, with the decisive quality of a woman who had made up her mind about something. She went back to what she was doing, and that was the end of the conversation. But it was also the beginning of something else. The particular social acknowledgement that came not from words but from the decision to work alongside someone, which in this kind of place meant more than any formal introduction. Mrs. Aldred remained careful. Eleanor did not expect more from her and did not receive it, and that was fine. Not every relationship resolved into warmth. Some of them just resolved into mutual management, and that was sufficient. So, Nora stopped expecting things to fall apart sometime in June. Eleanor couldn't have pinpointed the exact moment, but she saw it. The day the shoulder squaring in the kitchen doorway stopped happening automatically. The day Nora sat down to breakfast with an expression that was simply a 13-year-old girl in the morning, not a girl braced for impact. It was a small thing. It was enormous. She was teaching herself to sew properly that summer. Not just the basic mending she'd been doing out of necessity, but actual construction, making things. Eleanor taught her when Nora asked, which she did in her characteristic way, indirectly at first, watching Eleanor work until Eleanor simply handed her the piece and said, "Here, try it." She learned fast. She had always learned fast. She had had to. One evening in June, Nora came to Eleanor with a piece of blue cloth and a pattern she'd made herself, roughly, from paper. "I want to make a dress," she said, "for the summer. Can you help me cut it right?" Eleanor looked at the pattern. It was not technically correct in several ways, but the instinct behind it was sound. She'd understood the shape she was going for, had just misread how to get there. "Yes," Eleanor said. "Sit down. Let's look at this together." They sat at the kitchen table with the cloth and the pattern, and Eleanor walked her through it. Not by doing it for her, but by asking questions that led Nora to see where the adjustments needed to be, so that when they arrived at the right cut, it was Nora who understood why. "There," Eleanor said. Nora looked at the corrected pattern. Then she looked at Eleanor. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes. Are you happy here?" Not the way she'd asked before, with the specific urgency of a child asking because the answer affected her survival. Something different. Something more like the question a person asked when they genuinely wanted to know. Eleanor considered the question honestly because Nora deserved honesty and always had. "Yes," she said. "I am." "Even though it wasn't what you planned," Nora said. "Especially because it wasn't what I planned," Eleanor said. "I planned something smaller." Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm sorry. For the letters. For making you come here without your choosing to." "You know what's strange," Eleanor said, "is that I did choose. I chose at the depot when I could have gotten right back on the next train. I chose every morning for the first week when I could have left." She paused. "You gave me an opening. What I walked through it was mine." Nora looked at her with the expression she sometimes had that was too old for her face and exactly right for who she actually was. "I knew you'd stay," she said. "Did you?" "I hoped," Nora said. "But I read a lot. And you were the kind of person in the letters who would stay. I could tell." Eleanor looked at her. "You knew from the letters. You wrote back the same day," Nora said. "Every time. And you never made it about you. You always asked more about us." She looked at the pattern on the table. I thought someone who wrote like that would come, and someone who wrote like that would stay. I thought I was right, and I was scared I was wrong." Eleanor sat with this for a moment. This child had read her through 14 letters and made a bet on a stranger, and the bet had cost her deception and guilt and 2 years' worth of fear, and it had been accurate. Whatever Nora had seen in those letters, she had seen something real. "You were right," Eleanor said. Nora nodded once with the satisfaction of someone who has confirmed a long-held belief. Then she picked up the scissors and started cutting her cloth. And Eleanor watched her work, and the kitchen was warm and the door was open to the June evening, and somewhere outside George was explaining something to May in the yard, and the particulars of what Eleanor had and what she hadn't expected it to be resolved themselves, quietly and without ceremony, into simply this. But Caleb asked her to marry him in July, in the kitchen, on a Tuesday morning while she was making biscuits. It was not a dramatic proposal. He came in from the early barn work, poured his coffee, stood at the counter, and said, "I want to ask you something." "Ask," she said, not looking up from the dough. A pause. "I want to marry you," he said, "if you're willing. I want to make this official, real. I want you to be—" He stopped. "I want everyone to know you're here because you chose to be, because I asked you, not because of circumstances." Eleanor kept working the dough for a moment. Then she set it down and turned around and looked at him. He was standing at the counter with his coffee cup, and he looked like a man who had been working up to this for a while and was now slightly terrified of the answer, which was endearing in a way that his dignity probably would not have appreciated her pointing out. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath. "That's it?" he said. "What else do you want me to say?" "I don't know. Something." "Yes is sufficient," she said. Yes is the important word. He set down his coffee and came across the kitchen and stood in front of her. And she looked up at him, flower on her hands, Tuesday morning, and he kissed her properly this time, without horses complicating the logistics, and she put her flowery hands against his chest, and he didn't seem to mind. From the doorway, May's voice. "Are you kissing?" They pulled back. May was standing in the kitchen doorway in her nightdress, observing them with scientific interest. "Yes," Caleb said. "Why?" May said. "Because I asked Eleanor to marry me, and she said yes." May considered this information. "Does that mean she really lives here now?" "She already lives here," Caleb said. "I know," May said, with the satisfaction of someone whose position has finally been officially confirmed. "I've been saying that." She went back upstairs, presumably to inform the others, and she did, because approximately 4 minutes later, all 4 remaining children appeared in the kitchen in various states of morning undress, and Henry said, "Is it true?" And Caleb said, "It's true." And Clara made a sound that was small and involuntary, and then pressed her hand over her mouth, and George said, "Does that mean you're our, what does that make you?" Which was, Eleanor thought, a genuinely good question. "It makes me Eleanor," she said. "Same as I've always been, just officially." George appeared to find this satisfying. Nora stood at the back of the group, and her face was doing the thing again, the not-quite smile that was bigger than a smile, and she met Eleanor's eyes and did not say anything at all, which was enough. They were married in September, in the yard, with Ruth and her husband and a handful of neighbors, and all 5 children in their best clothes, May with a ribbon in her hair that she had selected herself after considerable deliberation. It was a small ceremony and a brief one. The county judge came out from Harlow, a spare man with good humor, and it was done in 20 minutes, and then there was food, because Eleanor had spent 2 days cooking for it, and it was a good spread, and she felt fine about saying so. Caleb stood beside her after the ceremony was done, and everyone was eating and talking, and he looked at her in the way he'd been looking at her since April, directly, without the old wall behind it, and he said quietly, "You all right?" "I'm very all right," she said. "Not what you imagined when you answered that advertisement," he said. "I imagined something," she said. This is better." He put his arm around her in the easy, unself-conscious way of a man who has gotten used to having someone beside him, and she leaned against him slightly, and they stood in the September yard and watched their family. Their family, that word settling into her like something put down after a long carry. Eat and talk in the afternoon light. May had gotten cake on her dress already, which was inevitable. George was telling someone about the fox, who had, as of last month, produced a litter. He had found the den in August, exactly where he'd theorized it would be, and had told everyone about this with the specific vindication of a child who has been right about something important. Henry was talking to Ruth's oldest son, who was 15, with the slightly awkward intensity of a boy who is figuring out how to have a conversation with someone his own age. Clara was helping pass food with the quiet competence she brought to everything, and she was smiling, which was not something she did effortlessly or often, and it changed her whole face. Nora was sitting on the fence rail at the edge of the yard, watching everything. She was eating a biscuit, and she looked like what she was, a 14-year-old girl on a good day with no particular place she needed to be except here. Eleanor caught her eye from across the yard, and Nora lifted her biscuit in a small acknowledgement, and Eleanor felt something that was complete and uncomplicated and did not require a more specific name than what it was. By the time the second winter came, the ranch was different, not unrecognizable. It was still the same land, the same house, the same cold, and the same work and the same relentlessness of what it took to live in this country. None of that had changed. What had changed was what it was sustained by. The fence line was sound. Caleb had spent the summer on it, and Henry had worked alongside him every day that wasn't needed elsewhere, and by August it was solid in a way it hadn't been in 2 years. The barn had a new door, the one that had been hanging off its hinge when Eleanor arrived, the small details she'd noticed in the dark that first night. The woodpile in November was higher than it had any need to be, which was Caleb's response to Eleanor's observation, made the previous February, that it was lower than she was comfortable with. He didn't say that was why. He just cut more wood. The larder was full in a way that was not precarious. Eleanor had spent the summer putting things by. She and Ruth had traded afternoons of labor for this, each helping the other, which was how it worked in this country, the exchange of time for time, presence for presence. The jars on the larder shelves were satisfying in a way that was partly practical and partly something else. The particular comfort of looking at a winter's worth of provision and knowing it's there. May had learned to read. Not fluently yet. She was 5. They weren't expecting fluency. But she could pick her way through short words with the focused effort of a child who wants very badly to be able to do something and is doing it by sheer will. She brought Eleanor books and pointed at words and said, "That one," which was her way of asking, and Eleanor told her, and May repeated it with the gravity of someone committing a thing to permanent memory. George had started keeping 2 notebooks now. The Fox notebook, which had expanded considerably since the litter, and a second one about weather, which he had developed after finding Eleanor's notes on Caleb's weather reading lessons. He was 9, and already connecting things that Eleanor thought were worth connecting. She had found him an almanac in Harlow, a proper new one, not the one she'd copied from, and he had read it with the focus that most children brought to stories. Clara had finished her first knitted garment that wasn't a practice piece, a pair of mittens for May, dark green, with a small embroidered flower on each back because Clara had decided they needed that, and they did. She had another project started already. She talked more now than she had in December, not a lot more, but measurably more, in the way that quiet people do when they feel the room is actually safe for their voice. Henry was 12 in October, and he was something between a boy and whatever came next, which was a difficult place to be in, which he navigated with the same stubborn competence he brought to everything. He and Caleb had built a relationship over the summer that was real, not the functional exchange of necessary information, but the actual thing, a father and his son working the same land with some mutual understanding of what it cost and what it was worth. Eleanor had watched this from a careful distance and had felt it the way you felt something that had been wrong for a long time coming right, not in an instant, but over many small moments, each one accumulating into something that held. Nora. Nora had started writing again. Eleanor had found her at it by accident in September, sitting at the kitchen table late, not with a household list or a task-related document, but with a notebook open and a pen moving across it, writing something that was clearly not practical. She had looked up when Eleanor came in, and for a moment had the expression of someone caught at something private, and then, after a beat, she'd held the notebook half toward Eleanor with the gesture of someone who has decided to let something be seen. Eleanor read the page. It was a story, a good one, not polished, not finished, but with the instinct of someone who understood how narrative worked from the inside. "You write," Eleanor said. "I've always written," Nora said. "The letters were—" She paused. "I was good at the letters because I've always written things, stories, since I was little." Eleanor handed the notebook back. "Keep going with this," she said. "It's probably not—" "Keep going with it," Eleanor said. Nora looked at her. Then she looked back at the notebook and kept going. There was a night in November, the 2nd November, winter come back around, when Eleanor sat at the kitchen table after everyone was in bed and thought about Ohio. She thought about it with the particular clarity that came from distance, the way you saw a place differently once you weren't in it. She thought about the rented room and the women at the sewing circle and the look on their faces when she'd said she was going west. She thought about the smallness of what she'd been walking toward in Millbrook. Not bad smallness, not the smallness of a life without value, but the smallness of a life that had stopped growing. The sense of walking in a circle in a room you already knew every corner of. She thought about that night on the train platform with 14 letters in her pocket, and a wind so cold it was practically an argument against the whole undertaking. She thought about 5 children coming across the depot lot in the dark, the oldest one carrying the youngest on her back, all of them out of breath, all of them running toward her. She thought about what it would have taken to get back on the next train. Very little, really. A single decision in the direction of self-preservation. She thought about the Eleanor who might have made that decision, who had reasons to make that decision, who would not have been unreasonable or weak for making it. That Eleanor would have gone somewhere else. started something else. Built something, probably. She was not a woman who failed to build things. But it would have been something smaller, something that fit within the outline she'd drawn for herself, the one that accounted for disappointment, that built in protection against wanting too much. She had not gotten back on the train. That was the thing, the central fact of it, the place she returned to when she wanted to understand how she had gotten from there to here. She had not gotten back on the train, and the reason, the real reason, under the practical ones, was that May had said, please, one word, 4 years old, in the dark, and something in Eleanor had recognized it. Not as a need she was obligated to fill, as a call she was able to answer. That was the thing that nobody told you about belonging somewhere, that it wasn't something that happened to you or was given to you or that you deserved. It was something you built with your hands, out of days, ordinary days, hard days, days when you made biscuits and showed a 13-year-old how to cut cloth and sat on the floor of a pantry with someone who was crying and didn't need you to fix it, just to stay. Belonging was something you kept choosing. She had chosen this place every morning she'd stayed in it. She had chosen it at the depot and in the kitchen and in the side yard, and every time she got up before dawn and stoked the fire and started the day. She would keep choosing it, not because it was easy, because it wasn't, and not because it was perfect, because it was nowhere near perfect, but because it was real, and it was hers, and she had helped make it what it was. She heard the stairs creak. Caleb came into the kitchen the same way he had that Christmas Eve, the way of a man who couldn't sleep and had come down without deciding to. He saw her at the table and said, "You're up late." "Thinking," she said. He sat down across from her. He didn't ask about what. He'd learned over months that she would say it if she wanted to and didn't need prompting. After a while, she said, "Do you remember the night we sat in this kitchen and you said you'd been going through the days?" He looked at her. "I remember." "Are you still?" she said. He considered this with the seriousness it deserved, which was one of the things she had come to count on, that he would take her questions seriously. "No," he said. "I'm in them now." A pause. Most days is enough," she said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the same way he had months ago, on the night after the children had stood in the main room and told him the truth. The same gesture, the same hand. Different weight to it now. Not tentative, not on the edge of something, but settled. "I was going to lose all of it," he said quietly. "I almost let myself." "But you didn't," she said. "No," he said. "I didn't." He looked at her hand under his. "The kids made that possible. You made that possible." "You made it possible," she said. "We just gave you something to make it possible for." He was quiet for a moment. The kitchen held them, the fire low and steady, the house asleep around them, the snow outside doing what snow did, and the wind doing what wind did, and none of that was different from what it had always been. Montana in winter, a ranch, a family, the same hard country it had always been. But the light in this kitchen was the light of a place that had people in it who meant to be here. That was the difference. Not the grand difference. Not the difference of transformation or rescue or any story with a clean arc. Just the daily difference of people who had decided, all of them, each in their own way, to stay. "Come to bed," Caleb said. "It's late." "I know," she said. She didn't move for another moment. She sat in the kitchen of the house she lived in, with her husband's hand over hers, and she thought about what it meant to answer a letter, to get on a train, to stand on a platform in the dark and not get back on. She thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who stayed. You didn't know, when you were on the train, what staying was going to cost you and what it was going to give you. You didn't know if the people at the other end of your choice were going to deserve it. You made the decision from the outside, without enough information, the way you always made the decisions that mattered. Not because you knew it would work, but because you were the kind of person who didn't leave a child in the snow and call it reasonable. The rest was work. Daily, unglamorous, continuing work. The work of building a life in a place and among people who were not perfect and never would be. That was what belonging actually was, under all the ways people romanticized it. It was the accumulation of ordinary days. It was staying when you could leave. It was choosing the same thing over and over without knowing for certain that you were right. She had not been wrong. She got up and took the lamp and went to bed, and Caleb followed her. and the kitchen was dark, and the house was quiet. And outside in the cold, the ranch sat in the winter dark. The mended fence, the full woodpile, the barn with its straight door, the land that would be green come summer. And it did not look like much from the outside. From the inside, it was everything.